Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very strange, the medieval mindset that still quietly runs our life. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's slightly ridiculous journey together. You probably think that the Carolina Lantern Man. Some true stories in American history refuse to die. They become legends. Tonight, we explore the chilling tale of North Carolina's Carolina Lantern Man. It begins on a stormy night in 1867. A railroad conductor named Joe Baldwin was working on the Atlantic coastline. Suddenly, he realized his caboose car had detached from the train, and another locomotive was speeding towards him from behind. Knowing a collision was inevitable, Joe grabbed his lantern. He ran to the rear platform, swinging it wildly in the dark, desperately trying to signal the oncoming train. But it was too late. The impact was horrific. Joe Baldwin was decapitated, his head lost in the nearby swamp. Rescuers found his body, but his head was never recovered. Weeks later, the sightings began. A mysterious light, a single lantern, was seen floating down the tracks at night. Locals believe it's the restless spirit of Joe Baldwin, still patrolling the abandoned path, forever searching for his missing head. This Mako light became so famous that even President Grover Cleveland claimed to have seen it. The tracks were removed in 1977, but the legend endures. To this day, people report seeing the phantom lantern still searching in the darkness. The Carolina Lantern Man, the lantern seen from a beach with no footprints. The island of Aegis was a monument to forgetting. Not a deliberate erasure, but a gradual, organic fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. It was an island where the present felt paper thin, easily punctured by the echoes of a distant past. And I, Elias Thorne, a cartographer whose trade was the precise delineation of the real, had come here to study the very landscape that seemed to resist definition. My cottage, a stone relic clinging to the cliff face, offered a panoramic view of the coastline. The beach below was an arc of fine, pale sand, perfectly smooth, a canvas wiped clean twice a day by the relentless cleansing tide. It was this beach, specifically its uncanny perfection, that had begun to chip away at my scientific resolve. I was an empiricist. I measured, I mapped, I recorded. Yet for 3 weeks, a subtle, impossible phenomenon had plagued my nightly observations. It happened precisely at the stroke of midnight. From the darkest reach of the beach, where the sand met the rockier, unnavigable headland, a light would appear. It was not the crisp white beam of a modern searchlight, nor the steady, cyclical flash of the old, abandoned lighthouse on the northern point. This was a softer, warmer, older kind of light, the golden, hesitant flicker of a lantern. It would move slowly along the curve of the shore, a solitary amber star traversing the black expanse. Sometimes it would pause by the tide line, its glow reflecting briefly in the retreating water before continuing its silent procession toward the southern cove. It never deviated from its path, and it always vanished precisely as the first faint hint of pre-dawn gray touched the eastern horizon. But the lantern itself was only half the mystery. The impossible half was the sand. Every morning I would descend the winding, narrow path to the shore, my boots crunching the scattered sea glass and pebbles. I would walk to the exact spot where the lantern had begun its journey, and then I would walk its entire route, meticulously searching. There were my footprints, deep, clear, and real. There were the swirling patterns of the wind, the delicate tracery of gulls' feet, and the faint ridged tracks of small nocturnal crabs. But there were no other human footprints, not a single indent. The sand where the lantern had moved was pristine, a velvet drape undisturbed. A man cannot carry a light over sand without leaving a mark. The laws of physics, of weight, of existence itself demanded otherwise. Yet here was the constant, maddening contradiction. I tried everything. I set up time-lapse photography, but the night fog, thick and swirling with salt, often obscured the light into a blurry orb, and the resulting images of the sand were inconclusive, just vast, empty gray. I used long-range binoculars, focusing on the light until my eyes burned, but the glass of the lantern was too old, too frosted with sea air to reveal any detail of the hand that held it. It was like watching a ghost's glow, a light carried by air. One Thursday night, driven by a growing, desperate need for an answer, I decided to intercept it. I waited in the gloom of the headland, nestled amongst the smooth, wave-worn boulders, my heart a dull, heavy drumbeat in my chest. I had brought only my notepad and a thick, heavy-duty flashlight, a symbolic gesture of my own unwavering, empirical light against the phantom's ancient glow. Midnight arrived, silent and absolute. The tide was low, revealing a broad expanse of damp, dark sand. And there it was, the lantern. It appeared not from behind a rock or out of a cave, but simply there, fully materialized and glowing, a yard from the water's edge. It was an antique ship's lamp, brass tarnished green with age, the glass panes slightly warped. The flame within was steady, casting a warm, intimate circle of light on the sand. I watched, frozen, as the light began to move, slowly, purposefully, at the gait of an aged person walking with care. I held my breath, focusing my entire being on the ground immediately beneath the lantern. The sand seemed to compress slightly under its ethereal weight, a flicker of indentation, but before the impression could solidify into a recognizable print, the grains seemed to rise and settle back into their smooth state, as if the very molecules of the beach were rejecting the memory of contact. It was not a footprint being erased. It was a footprint being prevented. A shiver colder than the sea air went through me. This was beyond optics, beyond atmospheric refraction, beyond any scientific explanation. This was intentional. As the light drew closer, a strange, sweet scent, salt, decay, and the ghost of lavender drifted towards me. I gripped my flashlight, my knuckles white, a part of me wanting to flee and a deeper, professional part demanding I stay, observe, and conquer the unexplainable. When the lantern was no more than 20 yards away, I acted. I leapt from my hiding place, shining my powerful flashlight directly at the glowing orb. "Stop!" I called out, my voice rough and too loud in the silent night. "Who are you? What are you doing?" The bright white beam of my flashlight instantly overwhelmed the soft amber of the lantern. For a disorienting second, everything was overexposed, blinding white light against pitch-black shadow. When my eyes adjusted, the lantern had stopped. It was still there, the light diminished by the intrusion of my beam, but still present, and standing beside it, silhouetted against the sea dark, was a figure. It was a woman. She was tall, wrapped in a long, flowing garment that might have been a cloak or a very old coat, heavy with the weight of woven wool. Her face was indistinct, shrouded by the hood of the garment and the competing lights. Yet I felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed, of deep, sorrowful eyes fixed upon me. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply stood, a dark pillar beside the floating lamp. "I am Elias Thorne," I said, forcing my voice to be steady. "I am mapping this coast. I've seen your light for weeks. I need to know, why do you walk here, and how do you leave no trace?" The silence that followed was immense, heavy with the sound of the ocean's distant breathing. Then, a sound, not a voice, but a gentle, resonant sigh carried on a gust of wind that had not existed a second before. The woman raised one hand, slow and deliberate. Not to shield her eyes, but to gesture. She pointed not at me, but at the lantern she carried, and then outward, to the dark, churning water of the open sea. In that gesture I understood. not with my intellect, but with a sudden cold certainty that bypasses reason. This wasn't a woman walking on the beach. This was a spirit, a memory, a mechanism of guidance. The light was a lure, perhaps, or a warning, or merely a vigil. And the lack of footprints was not a trick, but a statement. She was not tethered to the ground, to the present, or to the weight of human existence. Before I could process this realization, the white light of my flashlight flickered once, then died, plunged into the deepest possible darkness. My batteries, new only a week ago, were inexplicably drained. When my eyes recovered, seeking the amber glow, it was gone. The woman, the lantern, the scent of lavender, all had vanished. I stood alone on the beach, the vast, empty night pressing in around me. I fumbled with my flashlight, cursing, then gave up. I looked down at my feet. Around my worn leather boots, my own footprints were sharp, undeniable testimony to my physical presence. But just 10 feet away, where the woman and her light had stood, the sand was smooth, perfect, unblemished. I retreated, scrambling back up the cliff path, feeling as though I had inadvertently stepped into a mechanism of time and broken a vital spring. The next day, I didn't go down to the beach. I sat in my cottage staring at my maps. I found myself drawing a new symbol on my coastal chart. A small, faded star at the headland, followed by a dotted line arcing to the cove, with a small, hand-drawn lantern at the end. I labeled it not uncharted reef or dangerous current, but simply the passage. My rational mind, the mind of Elias Thorne, cartographer, fought a ferocious, losing battle with the sensory memory of the night. Must be an optical illusion. Reflected boat light, a local tradition, a lightweight drone. But I had seen the lack of prints, felt the cold wind, and seen the sorrow in the gesture of the shrouded figure. I knew then that the map of Aegis could not be completed with a ruler and compass. It required a different kind of tool, a willingness to chart not stone and shore, but grief and permanence. That night at midnight I was waiting again, but this time I stayed on the cliff. I had no flashlight. I had no camera. I simply watched. The lantern appeared, golden, gentle, and utterly silent. It moved with the same slow, deliberate pace. This time, I felt no fear, only a profound, almost reverent sadness. The figure was walking a path of memory, a line of light drawn for someone who would never arrive, or perhaps for a ship already lost. It was a perpetual, unmoving echo of a duty that had transcended death. The island of Aegis was a place of forgetting, but the woman with the lantern was the keeper. I packed my bags the next morning. My mission to map the coast was incomplete, but my life's work, I realized, was just beginning. I could not map her passage, but I could map the effect of her passage. I would record the silence, the impossible, smoothness of the sand, and the undeniable light, and I would leave the impossible space blank on my chart, a testament to the true nature of reality on the island of Aegis, that some stories are too old, too deep, and too profoundly sorrowful to leave a mark. I took one last look at the beach. The tide was out. The sand was perfect. No prints, save for the scattering of gulls near the water's edge. I left the island at dawn, carrying not a completed map, but a single profound truth, that the most real things in the world are those that cannot be measured, and the deepest histories are written in light upon a surface that remains eternally clean. The lantern's soft, warm light, visible from a beach with no footprints, was the most permanent landmark I had ever encountered. It was the indelible mark of something that could not be washed away. Sailors who followed the light and never returned. The sea around the Whispering Isles was a fickle mistress. One day she'd shimmer like scattered diamonds under a benevolent sun. The next, she'd churn into a malevolent ink-black beast, swallowing ships whole without so much as a final creak of timber. But for all her unpredictability, one thing remained constant, a beacon of hope and terror, the light from the black cairn. The cairn wasn't a lighthouse, not in the traditional sense. It was an ancient, jagged rock formation, taller than any edifice man had ever built, rising directly from the deepest, most treacherous waters of the archipelago. For centuries, at the very peak of the black cairn, a light would appear, not a steady beam, not a rotating flash, but a pulsating, almost breathing luminescence. Sometimes blue, sometimes green, often a captivating, otherworldly violet. It was said to be a guiding light, a promise of safe passage through the treacherous reefs and shifting sandbars that guarded the Whispering Isles, and it was said to be a deadly siren, luring sailors to their doom. I was old Silas Blackwood, and my bones remembered the sting of salt and the roar of gales better than they remembered my wife's face. I'd sailed these waters for 50 years, watched countless ships pass and mourned too many friends swallowed by the deep, and I'd seen the cairn's light, too. More times than I cared to count, every sailor knew the stories of men lost in fog or storm, who swore they saw the cairn's light pierce the gloom, promising a clear path to safety. They'd steer towards it, hearts swelling with relief, their ships cutting through the waves closer and closer to the radiant glow. And then, nothing. They simply vanished. No wreckage, no bodies, no distress signals. Just gone. The logbooks of their journeys would end abruptly, mid-sentence sometimes, as if the pen had simply been snatched from the hand. The villagers on. The main isle, Port Azure, had a saying, "When the cairn calls, the sea claims." My own brother Finn was one of them. It was a squall that had caught his brig, the Seagull's Kiss, unprepared. A sudden, violent tempest that brewed from nowhere. I was ashore that night, helpless, watching the horizon swallow the last glimmer of his sails. Days later, when the storm had passed and the search parties returned empty-handed, only one man, a trembling cabin boy found clinging to a spar miles from where the Seagull's Kiss was last seen, recounted Finn's last words. He said, he saw a light, Master Silas. Not the old lighthouse, a new one, brighter. He said it was guiding us. The boy's eyes were wide with a terror that even time couldn't wholly erase. He shouted, "The cairn! She's showing us the way home!" Finn was a seasoned captain, cautious to a fault, yet he had followed it, and he had never returned. After Finn's loss, I left the sea for a time. I couldn't bear the sight of it, knowing what it had taken. I became a fisherman, sticking to the safe, shallow waters close to shore, hauling, in nets, my gaze always drawn to the distant, menacing silhouette of the black cairn. Years turned into decades. The stories continued. Each new disappearance, each empty berth in Port Azure, fueled the legend. No one dared to approach the cairn in daylight. Its sheer, unyielding cliffs, devoid of life, seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, an ancient malevolence. Even the gulls avoided perching on its jagged peaks. I tried to warn them, the young, eager captains with salt water in their veins and ambition in their eyes. "Don't trust the cairn's light," I'd croak in the taverns, my voice rough with age and grief. "It ain't no friend to man." They'd nod, a polite reverence for the old salt, but in their eyes I'd see the spark of daring, the unspoken challenge. They believed themselves stronger, wiser, more fortunate than those who came before. They believed they would be the ones to break the curse, to follow the light and return to tell the tale. None ever did. One particularly stormy autumn, a heavy mist rolled in, blanketing the entire archipelago for days. It was a pea souper, the kind that steals landmarks and swallows sound, leaving sailors blind and deaf. Vessels were stuck, anchored in precarious spots, waiting for the fog to lift. Among them was the Sea Serpent, a fine clipper ship carrying precious cargo and, more importantly, my grandson, Thomas. He was only 20, fresh-faced and full of the romantic notions of the sea, just like Finn had been. He'd scoffed at my warnings, his youthful enthusiasm brimming. "Grandpa, the old tales are just that. Tales. We have compasses, charts, and the Lord's good grace." The fog thickened. 3 days, 4 days, 5. Port Azure grew silent, a collective anxiety hanging in the air. Ships that had left before the fog should have returned. Then the whispers began. Fishermen who had ventured out close to shore, braving the limited visibility, spoke of a strange phenomenon. "The cairn. It's light. It's brighter than ever, Silas." Old Jebediah stammered, his face pale, his hands trembling around a tankard of ale. "And it's moving. Moving." My blood ran cold. The cairn's light was always fixed, an unblinking eye. I went to the highest point overlooking the sea, my joints aching with every step. The fog was a vast gray blanket, but through a momentary tear, I saw it. The light. It was a brilliant, pulsating violet, a color I'd never witnessed from the cairn before. And it wasn't static. It was swaying, dancing, drawing intricate patterns in the dense mist, like a celestial lure. It appeared to be leading something, guiding it. And then I heard it. A faint, distant sound, like a horn cutting through the muffled air. It was the signal horn of the Sea Serpent. "No!" I rasped, my voice tearing in my throat. "Thomas! Don't follow it!" But the sound was already fading, drawing, closer to the cairn, lured by that hypnotic, impossible light. The Sea Serpent, undoubtedly disoriented and desperate in the endless fog, was blindly chasing the brightest thing it could find. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Thomas was about to join the ranks of the sailors who followed the light and never returned. There was no time for reason, no time for fear, only a burning, desperate need to break the cycle. I raced down to the docks, ignoring the shouts of the worried villagers. "Silas, what are you doing?" I launched my old fishing skiff, a small, battered vessel I usually kept close to shore. I wasn't equipped for open sea, certainly not for the deep, treacherous waters around the cairn, but my heart was a compass, pointing straight to my grandson. "I'm going after him," I yelled over the gathering wind. "You're mad! You'll be another one!" I ignored them. I knew the sea. I knew the reefs, the currents, the shifting moods. I knew the danger. But I also knew the light was a lie, and I had to prove it or die trying. The fog was a living thing, pressing in, disorienting me. I could barely see the bow of my own skiff, but ahead, through the swirling gray, the cairn's light pulsed. Violet, then emerald, then a deep, hypnotic blue. It was closer now, brighter, seemingly beckoning me. My mind, for a terrifying moment, felt a pull, a longing to surrender, to just let the light guide me. The thought was sweet, tempting. Let it take you, Silas. End the pain. But then, Finn's face flashed in my mind. And Thomas, so full of life, so eager for the world. No, I would not let them be lost to this deceit. I remembered something old man. Theron, the village's resident madman and lore-keeper, used to mumble. "The light, it feeds on hope, Silas, on the belief of safe passage. Starve it, and it loses its power." Starve it? How did one starve a light? I gripped the tiller, forcing my gaze away from the hypnotic glow. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting my other senses take over. The smell of salt, the feel of the waves, the subtle pull of the current. I remembered the old charts, the treacherous, unmarked rocks near the cairn. The real dangers, not the illusory ones. I began to steer by instinct, by memory, not by sight. I used the distant groan of the waves breaking on a familiar reef, the subtle shift in the wind's direction, to guide me. I was steering away from the direct path of the light, circling, approaching the cairn from its unguarded western side, where the current, through a thin patch in the fog, I saw it. The sea serpent. She was dangerously close to the cairn, her sails luffing, her crew huddled on deck, mesmerized by the violet glow that bathed her rigging. Thomas was among them, his face upturned, lost in its beauty. I had to break the spell. My skiff cut through the water, powered by a desperate strength I hadn't felt in decades. As I drew closer to the cairn, the light became almost unbearable, a physical presence. It was coming from a fissure high on the rock face, a jagged wound in the ancient stone, and there, inside the fissure, I saw it. It wasn't a lamp. It wasn't a beacon. It was a swirling vortex of energy, a cascade of pure, raw light that seemed to feed on itself. And within the light, indistinct, fleeting shapes. Were they faces? Faces of sailors, their expressions a mix of awe and terror, their forms swirling like mist in a breeze. Finn's face, for a fleeting moment, seemed to materialize, his eyes wide, his lips parted in a silent, eternal gasp. The cairn wasn't guiding them home. It was consuming them. Their hope, their life force, their very souls were fueling its endless, deadly glow. The light was a trap, a slow, beautiful devouring. "Thomas!" I roared, my voice raw, breaking through the eerie hum of the cairn. "Thomas, look at me!" "It's a lie." "It's a lie!" My shout, amplified by the close proximity of the rock face, echoed across the water. On the sea serpent, a few heads turned. Thomas's eyes, momentarily tearing away from the hypnotic light, found mine. There was confusion, then a flicker of recognition. "Grandpa?" His voice was a weak whisper. "Turn the ship!" I yelled, pointing away from the cairn, towards the faint, distant sound of the breaking waves on the real reefs. "Sail with the current. It's the only way." My skiff was now directly between the sea serpent and the black cairn, a fragile barrier. The light from the fissure intensified, burning into my eyes, trying to reclaim its hold. I felt its insidious tendrils reaching for my mind, whispering promises of peace, of reunion. But I fought back. I drew upon every ounce of strength, every memory of loss, every ounce of love for my grandson. The cairn takes. "It doesn't give!" I screamed, my voice cracking, a desperate challenge to the ancient evil. Perhaps it was my defiance. Perhaps it was the sheer force of my will. Or perhaps simply the sheer, unyielding stubbornness of an old man who refused to let another loved one be taken. As I screamed, something shifted. The pulsing violet light flickered, not out, but inward, drawing back into the fissure, as if recoiling from my raw, unyielding humanity. The faces within the vortex seemed to scream silently, their ethereal forms writhing as the light began to diminish, to recede. The spell on the sea serpent broke. A crewman shook his head, looking around with dazed horror. What happened?" "Full sails! Away from the cairn!" Thomas shouted, his voice finding its strength, spurred by my warning. He snatched the helm, pulling the ship hard to starboard, away from the deadly glow. The sea serpent groaned, turning slowly, ponderously, away from the light that was now fading, shrinking, becoming less alluring, less dominant. As the sea serpent pulled away, I watched the cairn's light. It dwindled, shrinking back into the fissure, becoming a faint, mournful glimmer. The humming ceased. The faces inside the vortex vanished. The cairn was still there, a dark, imposing monolith in the fog. But its deadly allure was broken, at least for now. I turned my skiff, following the sea serpent's retreating stern. The fog remained thick, but now a subtle, real wind was stirring, promising to push it away. We made it back to Port Azure, battered and shaken, but alive. Thomas, pale but safe, embraced me on the docks. "You saved us, Grandpa," he whispered, his eyes wide with a new, sober understanding. The light. It was calling to me. I felt it. I simply nodded, my own heart slowly settling. The cairn's light never again shone with the same intensity. It still appeared, a faint melancholic glow on stormy nights, a ghost of its former power. But it no longer fooled the sailors of Port Azure. They knew its truth now. They steered clear, respecting its ancient, hungry vigil, but never again following its deadly call. The stories of the sailors who followed the light and never returned became not just warnings, but a testament to the sacrifice of those who had gone before, and to the strength of an old man's love that finally broke the spell. And sometimes, on clear nights, I'd still stare out at the distant, silent cairn, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. It was there. But it no longer had power over us. We had learned to navigate the darkness and to resist the false promises of the light. The keeper who claimed the lantern was not human. The Isle of Solitude was well named. A dagger of granite thrust from the North Sea, it supported only two things: the monolithic gray of the Fenris lighthouse and its keeper, Alistair Finch. Alistair had been at Fenris for 27 years. He was an anachronism, a man who still polished the Fresnel lenses by hand and wound the massive clockwork mechanism. Despite the automation module humming quietly in the corner, ready to take over should he falter. His job was a devotion, a routine measured in the precise rhythm of the 4-second flash, 12-second darkness that was Fenris's unique signature. But the routine had been broken, and the break came from a light that was not his own. It began on the night the Maria went down, a clear, cold night in late autumn, the kind where the stars felt close enough to touch. The sea was calm. Fenris was functioning perfectly, its beams slicing through the black like a scythe. Yet the small fishing vessel was found the next morning shattered on the Needle Rocks, an outcrop 20 miles south of where the channel lay. The official report blamed navigational error. Alistair knew better. He had seen the other light. It appeared about an hour before the Maria's distress signal was silenced. It wasn't on the sea nor the sky. It was on the horizon, hovering just above the waterline, a glow of unsettling, incandescent blue. It was too steady to be a flare, too high to be a ship's lantern, and its color was wrong, a shade of electric, Arctic blue that had no place in the natural world. Alistair had watched it for an hour through his brass spyglass. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, drawing a perfect arc toward the treacherous Needle Rocks. And as the Maria approached the channel entrance, Alistair watched the blue light stop, then begin to pulse, mimicking a distressed flash, but in that alien, impossible color, the Maria, mistaking the color in the distance and desperation for a new, powerful beacon, had turned. It had followed the new light, and it had been lost. When the inquiry came, Alistair told them everything. He described the light, its color, its movements. The Maritime Board representatives, slick. Dismissive men from the mainland listened with expressions of strained patience. Mr. Finch, the lead investigator, a man named Henderson, finally said, tapping a pencil on his notepad, "You are claiming that an unknown non-human entity is operating a beacon capable of leading vessels to their doom?" "I am claiming that the light is not generated by any human technology or hand," Alistair corrected, his voice raspy from disuse. "It has no thermal signature, no visible source, and it is the color of ice fire. It is deliberate. It is a lure." Henderson sighed dramatically. "Alistair, you've been isolated here for a very long time. Perhaps eye strain, atmospheric lensing, or even..." He glanced pointedly at a bottle of medicinal brandy on Alistair's desk. "Something else is clouding your judgment." "I have watched this coast for 27 years, Alistair said, leaning forward, his eyes fixed on the man. "I know the fog, I know the refraction, I know the gulls and the stars. What I saw was an intelligent light source designed to override the familiar signature of Fenris. It is not human, and it is not natural. The board dismissed his claims as the ramblings of a solitary man nearing the end of his usefulness. They reinforced the automation module and left. Their last words a veiled warning about his retirement. Alistair, however, was now a man with a singular purpose: to prove that the lantern, as he had begun to call the phenomenon, was real, and to understand its non-human intelligence. His lighthouse, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, and its reliable golden beam felt like a child's toy against the vast, cold malice of the blue light. He started his vigil. He dismantled his life, replacing routine maintenance with frantic, meticulous observation. He covered the main lantern room windows with black canvas, leaving only a single narrow slit for his brass spyglass. He needed the deepest darkness to see the true nature of his enemy. He discovered its schedule. It didn't appear every night, only during a specific lunar phase, and almost always when a vessel was due to navigate the treacherous Fenris Channel. It was predatory. He began to chart its movements. With careful, trembling hands, he drew its path on a special vellum map. The blue light moved not in straight lines or predictable arcs, but in complex, almost mathematical vectors that seemed designed to intersect. It began its seductive dance, pulsing softly, beckoning the Triton away from the safety of Fenris's yellow beam. Alistair held his breath, his eye glued to the spyglass. The lantern was closer than ever. Through the magnification, he saw details that defied belief. The light source was not a flame nor a filament. It was a cluster of 3 perfect, small, interlocking spheres of sapphire blue energy suspended in the air. They rotated slowly, silently, and the light they emitted felt physically cold, like touching liquid nitrogen. There was no casing, no holder, no visible means of propulsion or power. Alistair wrote feverishly in his journal, "The light is a configuration, a geometric assembly of non-baryonic energy. It moves with a terrifying, absolute understanding of hydrodynamics and human fear. It is not guided. It is a sentient beacon." He had to communicate with the Triton. He grabbed the radio microphone, his hand shaking. "Triton! Triton! This is Fenris Light. Ignore the blue light on your port bow. I repeat, ignore the blue light. It is a danger. Stay on course! Follow the Fenris flash!" A crackle came over the radio. "Fenris, we hear you. But that new light, it's so powerful, Keeper. It's showing us a shortcut. Looks like a clear path. Our compass is going haywire, though." Alistair slammed his fist on the console. "Your compass is right. It's interference. The shortcut is the Needle Rocks. It is a trap. That lantern is not human. It does not want to guide you. It wants to sink you." There was a long silence, then a cautious, distant voice. "Keeper, are you all right? We're reporting a malfunction in the Fenris light system. The main beacon seems weaker." Alistair looked up. The giant Fresnel lens was functioning, the wick was trimmed, the oil level fine, but the intensity of the light had diminished. The blue light was somehow draining the power from the human light, not through electricity, but through some kind of resonant opposition. In desperation, Alistair threw open the main lantern room door, grabbed a heavy antique oil can, and hurled it with all his strength at the automation module. The small humming box shattered against the wall, sparks flying. Then he ran to the colossal brass-bound prism array of the Fresnel lens. His mind racing, he knew he couldn't compete with the blue light's strength, but he could change the signal. He could make the human light unstable. He jammed a small polished brass wedge, the kind used to hold the lens during maintenance, into the clockwork gear train that regulated the rotation. The mechanism shuddered, screamed in protest, and seized. The 4-second flash, 12-second darkness pattern instantly broke. Fenris's beam stopped sweeping. It froze, fixed directly on the Triton, bathing the ship in a solid, unmoving column of brilliant yellow light. The Triton was now caught between 2 opposing, non-cyclical lights. The constant, familiar human beam of Fenris and the pulsing, alien blue of the lantern. The blue light reacted instantly. It stopped pulsing and began to vibrate furiously, its spheres oscillating at a visible frequency. It was irritated. It was angry. It sped toward Fenris, no longer a lure, but an attacking drone. Alistair braced himself, staring out the glass. He heard a familiar voice on the radio, closer this time, almost a shout. "Fenris, your light is steady now. What in God's name is happening? We can see the blue thing. It's moving too fast. It looks like 3 electric wasps. It's coming for me!" Alistair yelled into the microphone. "Ignore it, Triton. Follow my steady beam and drive straight through the channel. Don't waver!" The blue lantern arrived at the lighthouse in seconds. It hovered inches from the thick, curved lens glass, its frigid blue light washing over the gold of Fenris. Alistair felt the cold immediately, a deep, bone-aching chill that penetrated the stone tower. The air in the lantern room dropped 20 degrees instantly. The lantern was trying to shut down the golden beam, to extinguish the human duty it represented. Alistair grabbed the first thing he could, a heavy, brass-polishing cloth weight, and slammed it repeatedly against the thick glass of the lens until a terrible spiderweb crack appeared directly over the blue spheres. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The blue spheres recoiled as if struck by a physical force. The light shrieked, a sound not of air, but of metal grating against bone. And then, with a sharp, crystalline crack, the 3 spheres disintegrated into blue dust that instantly vaporized in the sea air. The blue lantern was gone. Silence returned. The only sounds were the slow groan of the jammed clockwork and the rush of the wind, and the faint, retreating horn of the Triton. Alistair looked out. The Triton had passed safely through the channel, heading for the open sea. It had survived. He collapsed onto the floor, the cold radiating from the shattered glass, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was found the next morning by the supply boat. Alistair was alive, but the Fenris light was broken. The clockwork mechanism was jammed. The automation module was destroyed, and the valuable lens had a massive, radiating crack. Henderson returned with the Coast Guard team. He surveyed the damage, his face a mask of official fury. "Finch!" he snapped, pointing at the cracked lens. "What is the meaning of this destruction? You were told to simply monitor the light." "I broke the light," Alistair whispered, still shivering, his eyes on the sea. "To save the Triton from the other light." "There was no other light, you old fool." Henderson raged. The Triton reported a blinding, steady white light and a man screaming, "It is a trap!" "A clear case of mental breakdown." Alistair simply pointed to the crack in the glass. It was not white. It was blue. And it was not human. He was relieved of his duties, deemed mentally unfit, as he was being rowed away from the Isle of Solitude for the last time. He looked back at the Fenris light. The Coast Guard had installed a temporary, modern strobe light, efficient but soulless. The new light's beam swept the horizon. It was a cold, regular flash. Alistair looked out to the far western point. The sun was setting, painting the sky in reds and golds. And then, just above the waterline, a faint, tiny, deep violet pinprick of light appeared. It was unsteady, barely visible, but it was there. Alistair smiled a cold, tired smile. The intelligence had learned. It had changed its frequency, its color, and its geometry. It had survived. He had won the battle, but he had not killed the threat. The lantern was still out there, an alien. Non-human intelligence with a cold, geometric malice, waiting for the night and the inevitable return of human hope, only to lead it to despair. As the boat pulled away, Alistair knew his duty was not done. He had failed to convince them of the truth, but he had proven one thing. Sometimes to protect humanity, one must break the very mechanism of human order. Ship logs, mentioning a man of smoke and salt. The archive room of the Royal Nautical Society in London was a tomb of forgotten voyages. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight that pierced the high vaulted windows, illuminating rows upon rows of leather-bound chronicles. Dr. Aris Thorne, a maritime historian more comfortable with dead languages than living company, was charting anomalies. His current obsession, the recurring mention of a figure known only as the Navigator of the Shrouds, or more poetically, the Man of Smoke and Salt. The entries were sparse, scattered across centuries and continents, appearing only in the logbooks of vessels that had vanished or been found later, crewless and adrift. Aris first found the phrase in the Journal of the Sea Witch, a clipper lost in the Pacific in 1888. The final entry, scrawled in a frantic hand. Fog thickens, compass spins. See him, a man of smoke and salt at the helm, laughing. We follow his shadow and not the star. The second was from the Pequod II, a modern fishing trawler recovered near the Faroe Islands in 1997. Its digital log, partially corrupted, contained a corrupted phrase, error. Deviation, 40 degrees starboard. The smoke and salt. The final entry, time-stamped 03 Zaz hours. He is here. He has taken the wheel. He is a man of smoke and salt. We are sailing home! The coordinates noted were hundreds of miles from any known shipping lane or port. Aris was convinced this wasn't folklore or hallucination. These logs were written by sober, professional mariners, separated by decades and technologies. The consistency was unnerving. The Man of Smoke and Salt was not a storm nor a reef. He was an intelligent force that took control of the vessel and steered it to an impossible destination. He devoted 2 years to mapping the occurrences. He found a pattern. The Man of Smoke and Salt only appeared in deep fog, during a full moon, and most chillingly, only when the ship's captain was suffering from a profound, secret despair. The Man of Smoke and Salt was drawn to grief and disorientation. His search led him to the final, most complete account, tucked away in the private papers of the notorious pirate-turned-privateer, Captain Elias Vane. Vane's ship, the Gale's Fury, was presumed sunk September 14, 1721. Latitude, 47°. My dearest Eleanor, I write this not with the expectation of its delivery, but as a final confession. We are lost. Not merely adrift, but spiritually and geographically adrift. 3 days under a fog so thick it drinks the daylight. I have not seen the sun, the moon, nor any star. The crew is restless, their faces pale as candle wax. And I, your husband, am hollowed out by a despair far deeper than the sea itself. I have done terrible things in my life, Eleanor, but my greatest sin was the lie I told you, the one I have lived. Now the fog is forcing me to face it. My mind is shattered, and my ability to navigate is gone. I have given up the wheel. It was then he appeared, an answer to my surrender. He came from the mist, coalescing on the main deck near the binnacle. Not a corporeal man, but a shape defined by a swirling absence. He looked like the leftover residue of a bonfire on a rainy beach, a silhouette of smoke given momentary form, smelling intensely of ozone and dried salt. He was wearing the rough-spun clothes of a drowned sailor from an age long past, but his face was a shifting blur, never resolving into recognizable features. He carried a faint, cold light, not a lantern, but the residual luminescence one sees on rotting timber in the dark. He did not speak. He simply glided toward the helm, his every movement whispering of the deep. There were no footprints on the wet deck, only a thin film of brine that evaporated instantly behind him. My first mate, Silas, drew his cutlass and challenged him. The Man of Smoke and Salt did not look at him. He merely extended a hand, a skeletal thing of braided vapor, and touched Silas's chest. The poor boy dropped the cutlass and stood utterly frozen, his eyes wide and lifeless, fixed on the fog. He is still standing there now, a statue of terror. The Man of Smoke and Salt took the wheel. His touch did not make the wood wet, but dry and cold like ash. The ship, which had been wallowing aimlessly, instantly sprang to life. She is moving now, slicing through the waves with a purpose I have not given her. The speed is impossible for this wind, I asked him, finally, through trembling lips, where he was taking us. The man of smoke and salt finally responded. Not with sound, but with an echoing clarity in my mind that silenced every thought. Home, Captain. Where the water is forgotten. I tried to fight him, to wrestle the wheel away. But my hands passed right through his smoky form, and the cold was blinding. I realized he was steering the ship not with physical force, but with the gravity of desire. He knew exactly what my despair longed for. Oblivion, the cessation of guilt, the deep, perfect silence only the ocean can offer. I am not following him, Eleanor. I am being pulled by the weight of my own soul, and he is merely the hand guiding the rudder. We are now in waters that are utterly calm, surrounded by the deepest, whitest fog I have ever known. The silence is crushing. The crew, those who haven't collapsed into catatonic despair like Silas, are singing hymns, convinced this is the path to heaven. They have surrendered to the lie. He is taking us to a place that exists outside of maps. A final harbor built from forgotten regrets. I see a light now, Eleanor. It's not the man of smoke and salt's faint glow, but a grander illumination, ahead in the mist. It looks like a city, built of pure moonlight and endless water. I know it's the end. I am sealing this now, tossing it overboard in the hope that if one of my sins can be forgiven, it is that I told you the truth of my end. Forgive me, my love. I followed the man of smoke and salt, and I will never return. Your eternally lost Elias. Eris finished reading the letter, his hands clammy. The man of smoke and salt was not a legend. He was a psychopomp of the sea, a harbinger of a supernatural, inescapable shipwreck. His destination, where the water is forgotten, sounded like a poetic definition of death itself. The historian felt a sudden, inexplicable compulsion to see this entity for himself. He chartered a small, sturdy research vessel, the Antikythera, and sailed to the final recorded location of the gale's fury. He prepared meticulously. He filled the Antikythera with high-tech sensors, thermal cameras, and electromagnetic scanners, weapons of empirical observation against the supernatural. But his greatest preparation was internal. He ensured he was entirely free of despair. He was a dedicated academic with no great losses or crushing regrets. He was a blank slate, theoretically immune to the man of smoke and salt's lure. The full moon arrived. The fog rolled in, a gray, suffocating curtain that swallowed the world. Eris was on the bridge, surrounded by humming monitors, the Antikythera maintaining a steady course on autopilot. The air grew cold, heavy with ozone, and the distinct, abrasive smell of dried salt. His thermal camera flickered, detecting a shape on the foredeck, an outline of zero heat, a silhouette of absence against the ambient temperature. And then he saw him, the man of smoke and salt. He stood near the bow, his form an impossible lattice of drifting vapor. He was taller than any man, and his limbs moved with an unsettling fluidity. He looked exactly as Vane had described, an eternal sea-soaked shadow. The figure turned, and Eris felt the expected mental intrusion, a powerful, silent inquiry into his soul. Where is your guilt? Where is your sorrow? Eris held firm, focusing on his screens, on his data, on the measurable reality. I have none for you, Wraith. I am here to observe. The man of smoke and salt seemed surprised. The smoky outline of his face sharpened for a fraction of a second, as if trying to resolve a puzzle. Then the entity glided forward, passing through the radar dome until he stood inches from the bridge window. Eris could smell the salt and the cold, acrid smoke. The man of smoke and salt raised a hand, the braided vapor, and tapped the thick glass. Eris had expected the silent, tempting voice of despair. Instead, the man of smoke and salt communicated a single chilling thought, not to Eris, but to the ship. Navigation is a burden. Certainty is a curse. The Antikythera's autopilot shrieked. The GPS coordinates flashed wildly. The radar became a chaotic mess of false signals. The ship's systems were not malfunctioning. They were being convinced that they were wrong. The man of smoke and salt was not just luring captains. He was confusing the very tools of navigation, erasing the logic of the sea. Eris felt a creeping dread. He hadn't brought despair, but he had brought certainty, and the man of smoke and salt was dismantling the certainty of the Antikythera itself. The entity shifted its attention back to Eris. The silent question was sharper this time. "You are empty. What do you seek?" "I seek knowledge," Eris declared, his voice trembling but loud. "I seek the reason you take these men. Where do you lead them?" The smoky figure wavered, amused. He gestured toward the open sea, shrouded in the moon-drenched fog. "They seek rest from the compass," the thought echoed in Eris's mind. "They seek the forgiveness the sea cannot grant. I merely show them the true depth of their own desire. I guide them to the harbor of no return. And you, historian, you seek to chart the unchartable. That, too, is a profound form of despair." The figure then reached out, and this time he touched the ship's wheel. The wood instantly dried, leaving a film of salt crystals. The Antikythera, now stripped of its electronic certainty and influenced by the subtle, irresistible cold of the entity, began to turn. It was turning toward the coordinates of the Pequod 2's last entry. Hundreds of miles away, Eris realized the truth. He might not have personal despair, but his obsessive quest for the answer, his willingness to risk everything for a final, tangible truth, was his own form of spiritual emptiness. He was the perfect passenger. He broke the trance. He grabbed the emergency axe hanging by the door and, with a shout born of pure, desperate self-preservation, he swung it, not at the man of smoke and salt, but at the binnacle, the sacred housing of the magnetic compass. The glass shattered. The delicate magnet spun violently, freed from its casing. The instant the certainty of the ship was destroyed by human violence, the man of smoke and salt recoiled. His smoky form blurred as if a sudden wind had hit him. He was a creature that operated in the realm of suggestion and guilt, not raw conflict. The entity's final thought was a cold, quiet sigh. "You have chosen the chaos of life over the peace of death. You will regret the effort." And then he was gone. Dissipated back into the salt-laced ozone of the fog, Eris was left alone on the turning ship, surrounded by wailing alarms and dead monitors. He grabbed the manual wheel and forced the Antikythera back onto its original heading. He returned to London, his mission a failure. He had gained no data, no proof, only a terrifying confirmation. He had seen the man of smoke and salt, and he had escaped because he chose the violent uncertainty of life over the tempting peace of surrender. He added one final, private end. He closed the logbook, knowing he could never publish his findings. The world demanded empirical proof, not the dark poetry of a sailor's end. But Eris Thorne, the historian, now knew that the most important truth of the sea was written not in precise coordinates, but in the terrifying, smoky handwriting of the ancient mariner of loss. The night the beacon glowed blue. The lighthouse at Point Lyra had been a steadfast sentinel for 150 years. Its light was a reliable, comforting gold, a slow, methodical flash that spoke of human engineering and safety. Its signature, 3 golden flashes every 20 seconds, was as familiar to the mariners of the Great Bay as their own names. Elias Vance. The solitary keeper was the latest in a long line of Vances to tend the light. He was 72, a man carved from salt and silence, whose days were measured by the clockwork mechanism and the polish on the massive Fresnel lens. He knew the light's rhythm, the scent of its polished brass, and the predictable hum of the diesel generator better than he knew the faces of his grandchildren on the mainland. But the night of October 23rd was different. The weather was unnatural. Not a storm, but a profound, smothering stillness. The air was heavy, tasting metallic, and the sea was flat and black, reflecting the sky like oil. The stars, usually sharp and numerous, seemed muted, their light barely penetrating the strange, high haze that had rolled in at dusk. Elias was in the lantern room, performing his final inspection before turning in. The great light was operating perfectly, throwing its 3 comforting golden arcs across the water. Then, the hum changed. It wasn't a mechanical fault. It was a new sound, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in the soles of Elias's worn leather boots. It wasn't coming from the generator. It was coming from the light itself. Elias peered through the glass. The light source, a powerful incandescent bulb, was flickering rapidly, struggling against an unseen force. Then, with a loud, distinct crack that echoed through the lantern room, the gold vanished. In its place bloomed a chilling, incandescent blue, not the cool, steady blue of an arc lamp or a sodium vapor light. This was a deep, electric, crystalline blue, the color of glacial ice seen in total darkness, radiating an almost painful intensity. Elias stumbled back, clutching his chest. Point Lyra's signature was broken. The gold was gone. The night the beacon glowed blue had arrived. He rushed to the emergency manual. There was nothing in the keeper's logs or the technical manuals about a color change. He checked the bulb, the wiring, the generator. All systems reported normal. Yet the light remained terrifyingly blue. He radioed the mainland Coast Guard station. Point Lyra to Coast Guard. Emergency. My light has changed color. It's solid blue. Repeat, solid blue. Unknown cause. It is not mechanical. The reply was immediate, laced with confusion and urgency. Lyra, we read you. Blue? That's impossible. Your log shows 3 flashes of gold, Keeper. Are you confirming your signature is not functioning? The flash is functioning, Elias rasped, looking at the lens. But the color is blue. It's wrong! It's going out to sea right now, 3 pulses of blue light. Tell the fleet to ignore it! Lyra, our visual spectrum scanners are detecting a normal signature, 3 rapid flashes of warm light. We see nothing blue. Are you certain you haven't had a system failure that's affecting your vision? Elias looked at his own hand, bathed in the unearthly blue glow that saturated the lantern room. He could see the veins beneath his skin, the color so intense it felt physical. I am certain, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The light is blue here, deep Arctic blue, and I believe only I can see it. The Coast Guard assumed mechanical failure combined with sensory delusion and dispatched a maintenance crew due to arrive the next afternoon. Elias was left alone with his blue terror. He spent the next hour documenting the phenomenon. He tried taking photos with his digital camera. The resulting images showed only the expected 3 golden flashes. He held a thermometer to the thick glass. The temperature was dropping rapidly, far below the ambient room temperature. The blue light radiated cold. Then he saw it. Through the blue light, out on the sea, something was moving. It was a small, 3-masted schooner, the Odyssey. Elias knew it well. A tourist vessel heading to the historic port across the bay. It should have been sailing far south, parallel to the coast. Instead, it was turning, its sails catching the cold blue light, steering directly toward the Fenwick Shoals, a notoriously fatal labyrinth of hidden rocks and shifting sands. The blue beacon was not merely a malfunction, it was a trap. Elias understood now why the Coast Guard saw gold. The blue light wasn't an emission for the world, but a distortion meant for specific targets, those lost in the haze, or those like himself who were attuned to the precise reality of the light. The blue light was not a call. It was a lure. He raced to the radio. Odyssey, Odyssey! This is Lyra Light. You are off course. Turn hard to starboard. You are heading for the Fenwick Shoals. A youthful, panicked voice answered. Lyra, we thought your light was guiding us. It's so clear. It showed us a straight line through the fog, a perfectly clear path to the port. It's a lie! Elias shouted, looking at the Odyssey, now bathed in the deadly blue glow. It's wrong. Turn back now! The path is south. But your light is shining directly on the path, Keeper. It's the brightest thing on the sea. We trust your light. The finality in the young voice was chilling. They trusted the light of Point Lyra, the light Elias was sworn to keep true, which was now an instrument of deceit. Desperation fueled him. He knew he couldn't stop the blue light directly. It was beyond his physical means, but he could stop the mechanism. He ran to the base of the lantern room where the massive, century-old clockwork mechanism was housed, a labyrinth of brass cogs, weights and levers that slowly rotated the lens. He grabbed an iron pry bar and jammed it into the main gear. With a sound like a cannon shot, the brass gear snapped. The clockwork mechanism shuddered, screamed, and seized. The rotation stopped. The lens halted mid-sweep. The powerful light of Point Lyra, whether gold or blue, was now fixed. A solid, blinding beam, locked directly onto the Odyssey. The Odyssey, however, was still moving. It was sailing out of the light, following the false straight path. Elias had failed to stop the trap. He had only succeeded in breaking his own sacred machine. He looked back at the light source. It was still fiercely, chillingly blue. He watched as the blue light seemed to condense. The three intense spots of blue light shrank, pulled together into a single, overwhelming point of sapphire energy. Then, from the lens, a strange image began to project into the fog. Not a beam of light, but an image within the blue light. It was a vast, towering archway, built of impossibly thin, glowing blue lattice. It seemed to float just above the horizon, beckoning the Odyssey forward. It wasn't a structure. It was a portal, shimmering in the intense blue. The light was not guiding ships to the shore. It was guiding them off the map. Elias ran back to the window, ignoring the searing cold radiating from the glass. He grabbed the emergency flare pistol. He aimed the pistol not at the blue light, but past it, out toward the Odyssey. He fired the flare. The flare shot up, a sudden, violent burst of raw, human red. The red exploded high above the ship, a brilliant, terrifying contra-signal of distress. The red light momentarily clashed with the blue glow, and the effect was like a physical blow. The blue light from the beacon flickered violently, and the shimmering portal image vanished. On the Odyssey, the captain's voice screamed over the radio, "We see the flare! Red! Red means danger! Hard to starboard! I see the rocks! We almost hit the rocks! Who is showing the blue light? What is happening? The blue light is a lie!" Elias screamed into the mic. "The red light is the truth! Follow the red, Captain! Get out!" He fired a second red flare, then a third, until the sky above the Fenwick Shoals was a desperate, blinking constellation of human alarm. The Odyssey's engine roared to life. The ship turned sharply, scraping past the edge of the deadly shoals, steering desperately away from the magnetic pull of the light. It was saved by the primal, unmistakable symbol of human danger. When the last red flare died, Elias looked back at the lantern. The intense blue was fading, shrinking, pulling back. With a final faint thump, the light source died. Elias was left in the deep, heavy darkness, punctuated only by the distant, relieved horn of the Odyssey sailing safely into the channel. The sun rose hours later, painting the sea in hues of weary gray and pink. The Coast Guard crew arrived, found the shattered clockwork, the dead generator, which had inexplicably failed after the clockwork broke, and Elias Vance slumped by the controls, his hands blackened with soot and oil. He told them his story again, the blue light, the trap, the portal. Henderson, the investigator, pointed to the... Elias was removed from Point Lyra. As he sailed away on the Coast Guard cutter, he looked back at the lighthouse. Its replacement beacon, a temporary, blinking strobe, flashed a reassuring, ordinary white. But as the cutter crossed the line where the Fenwick Shoals lay, Elias saw it. Not in the sky, but deep, deep in the water, miles below the surface. A faint, pulsating blue glow. It was not gone. It was submerged. It was waiting for the light to return to its comforting, predictable gold. The blue was not a color of the air or the light. It was the color of the deep, the color of something ancient and patient, that used the very promise of human safety to lure ships to their doom. He left Point Lyra, carrying with him the terrible truth. The night the beacon glowed blue had not been an event. It had been an unveiling, and the sea had only just begun to show its true colors. Survivors who spoke of a voice, singing the North Atlantic in the grip of the brutal winter of 1959 was an efficient, cold cemetery. The siren's call, an obsolete but sturdy freighter hauling timber from Newfoundland, was swallowed whole by a rogue wave one freezing, moonless night. When the Coast Guard finally located the wreckage 3 days later, they found two things. The siren's call was reduced to splintered timber scattered across a 50-mile radius, and miraculously, there were 3 survivors. They were pulled from the water clinging to a single, oil-slicked life raft, hypothermic, traumatized, but alive. Captain Finnegan Doyle, First Mate Alana Reyes, and a young engineer named Caleb Stone. The official inquiry was swift. The weather reports confirmed a sudden, localized squall. The rogue wave theory was plausible. The only lingering question was the 3 testimonies, all rendered separately in the quiet desperation of a mainland hospital room, each account chillingly consistent. They all spoke of the singing Alana Reyes. A practical woman known for her cold sobriety was the first to give her full statement. She was lucid, but her eyes held a distant, terrible rapture. "The wave hit us, Captain, you know that." The lights went out. The engine screamed. We were pitched into the black water. The cold, it was absolute. It was the kind of cold that steals your breath and stops your heart in seconds. She paused, wrapping her arms around her thin blanket. But then, the cold stopped being the worst thing. Suddenly, there was the voice. The investigator, a skeptical naval lieutenant named Harrison, leaned forward. "A voice, Miss Reyes? Someone shouting in the water?" "No, sir. Not shouting, singing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even close, but it was there under the sound of the churning water. It was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard." "What was it singing?" Alana frowned, a confusion that seemed born of spiritual rather than mental block. It wasn't a language. No words I could understand. But the meaning was clear. It was singing of peace, of warmth. It promised that if we just let go, if we just stopped fighting the cold and the water, everything would be well. It was a song of home. She confessed that she had nearly let go of the life raft, tempted by the sheer, seductive comfort of the sound. She only held on because she saw Caleb, the young engineer already slipping away, his eyes glazed with a beatific smile, stretching his hand out towards the open sea. Caleb Stone's testimony was the most unnerving. Young and barely trained, he had been pulled from the brink of hypothermia. He spoke of the voice with a fanatic's devotion. "I have never been so cold, sir. But when the voice began, I felt warm." The fear left. I closed my eyes and I saw her, not a mermaid, sir, but a woman made of mist and moonlight. Her skin was the color of wet granite, and her hair flowed like kelp in the current. And she sang, sir. What did she sing to you, Caleb? She sang my name. She sang about my mother, sir, who died when I was small. She promised me my mother was waiting just beyond the waves and that the water was only a doorway. She told me to trust the dark. It was the song a child should hear when falling asleep. Caleb's eyes filled with tears, not of pain, but of longing. I wanted to go. I was angry when Captain Doyle pulled me back. He ruined the song. He stopped me from going home. The medical staff chalked it up to hypothermic hallucination, the mind creating comforting fantasies to rationalize the trauma of freezing to death. Lieutenant Harrison was ready to close the file, but then came Captain Finnegan Doyle. Finnegan was a man who had stared down typhoons and icebergs. He was a veteran of 2 wars and a confirmed atheist. He did not speak of home or mothers or peace. He spoke of duty. I heard the voice, Finnegan stated flatly, his own shivering controlled by sheer force of will. It was the most manipulative, evil sound I have ever encountered. And I recognized it. Recognized it, Captain? Yes. It was the same sound that took my first vessel, the Morning Star, 30 years ago. Back then, they said it was a hallucination too. But I knew. I knew the voice had returned for my soul. Finnegan confirmed Alana and Caleb's description. A song without words, beautiful, mesmerizing, and filled with promises of rest. But Finnegan heard something different in the melody. It wasn't singing of peace, Lieutenant. It was singing of forgetting. It was singing about how pointless my life was, how the effort of survival was nothing compared to the deep, silent rest of the sea floor. It sang of my failures, my regrets, every mistake I ever made, and told me the only solution was to sink, to surrender my consciousness. And what did you do? I sang back, Finnegan said, a grim triumph in his voice. I didn't sing hymns or sea shanties. I sang the bills of lading. I sang the cargo manifesto. I sang the coordinates of the wreck. I sang the bloody logbook entries. The investigators exchanged bewildered glances. I fought the spiritual seduction with mundane reality, Finnegan explained. I focused on my duty, on the fact that I was accountable for the manifest and the lives under my command. I treated the siren's call as a problem to be solved, not a tragedy to be accepted. The voice hated it. It sputtered. It weakened. It wanted my despair, and I gave it bureaucracy instead. He held up his scarred, swollen hands. I never let go of the life raft. I was fighting two fights, the cold and the song. The song was the harder fight. Finnegan's testimony split the investigation. The younger survivors, susceptible to the lure of comfort and reunion, heard a siren. Finnegan, the hardened captain defined by responsibility, heard a psychopomp, a guide to a final permanent surrender. Eris Thorne, the historian who had tracked the man of smoke and salt, read the siren's call file years later, recognizing the entity's pattern of preying on a specific human vulnerability. The singing was a more ancient, more potent version of the smoky figure's silent, despairing allure. Driven by an academic obsession, Eris found Finnegan Doyle, who now lived a solitary life maintaining a small, private lighthouse on the coast of Maine. "Captain," Eris said, presenting the old file, "I believe the voice you heard was real. I believe it is an entity that seeks to guide the willingly lost to a place they call where the water is forgotten. Did you ever see the source of the voice?" Finnegan took a long drag from his pipe, the smoke mixing with the salt air. "See her? No, but I felt her. She was the sea's own gravity, pulling on the heaviest part of us, our guilt." "But you fought her with the logbook," Eris pressed. "You fought the ultimate peace with the ultimate duty." Finnegan nodded slowly. "The song wasn't meant for my ears, Doctor. It was meant for my soul. It wasn't trying to lure the ship to the rocks. It was trying to lure the captain to surrender. The voice knew that if the captain gives up, the ship and the crew follow." He explained the terrifying moment of his survival. He realized that the voice's melody was subtly altering the crew's perception of direction. It wasn't guiding them to land. It was guiding them to the deepest part of the wreck site, where the cold would be absolute and retrieval impossible. "She wanted us perfectly, quietly gone," Finnegan said, and the music was simply the bait. Eris was fascinated. "And Caleb and Alana? What happened to them?" Finnegan's face clouded. Caleb never recovered. He went mad. He spent his life searching for that melody, walking the shore, singing to the waves. He followed the voice in the end, off a small dock in the fog. And Alana? She was wiser. She was broken, but she used her breaking. She never sailed again, but she became an emergency dispatcher for the Coast Guard. She listened to every voice of panic on the radio, every moment of despair. She said she was standing guard, listening for the voice trying to sneak into the airwaves. She fought the song with the constant human cacophony of rescue. Finnegan drew on his pipe again. He stood up, walking to the edge of the cliff. The survivors who spoke of a voice singing were the ones who truly understood the depth of the sea's temptation. They came back with the scars of a beautiful lie on their souls, and for some, the lie was too sweet to forget. As Eris watched the waves crash, he realized the ultimate horror. The voice was the sea's way of internalizing the shipwreck. It didn't need a storm or a reef or a fog. It only needed the whisper of failure in a man's heart. The song was still out there, an infinite melody of rest and forgiveness, waiting for the cold, the darkness, and the perfect moment of human surrender. And the price of hearing it was the loss of everything, including the will to live. Eris left the lighthouse, taking with him the captain's final chilling thought. The greatest danger at sea is not the monster in the waves, but the music of your own deepest desire to finally stop fighting. A boat found with every lantern smashed. The Luminara, a sturdy 30-foot ketch, was discovered 20 nautical miles off the coast of the Outer Banks, adrift and perfectly intact. She sailed into the Coast Guard yard in Wilmington under tow, a ghost ship carrying no bodies, no blood, and no answers. Retired Chief Petty Officer Marcus Keene, a salvage expert with a reputation for solving maritime puzzles, was called in. He walked the empty deck, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. The Luminara was meticulously maintained. The galley was spotless. The bunks were made. A pot of coffee, cold and syrupy, sat undisturbed on the stove. It looked less like a vessel abandoned in panic and more like a home vacated with grim, deliberate haste. But the moment Marcus descended into the cabin, the atmosphere shifted from strange to utterly chilling. The main cabin was a scene of calculated, focused destruction. Not of furniture or fittings, but of every single device designed to give or hold light. Every electric light fixture had been torn from its mountings, the bulbs crushed and scattered like crystalline dust. The running lights, thick glass lenses normally bolted with heavy brass, had been methodically smashed with a heavy implement, likely a hammer. The battery pack for the emergency flares was ripped open, the magnesium rods bent and useless. The oil lamps were the worst. There were 4 antique brass lamps in the cabin, each a heavy piece of hardware. The glass chimneys were reduced to fine shards, and the brass reservoirs had been dented and punctured. The oil spilled and congealed in black pools. In the navigation station, the final dreadful tableau, the powerful main searchlight, mounted on a swivel, was lying on the chart table. Its heavy glass dome was fractured into 1,000 pieces, and the parabolic reflector, once a brilliant mirror, was scored deep with multiple strikes. Marcus cataloged the damage, realizing the full scope of the act, a boat found with every lantern smashed. It was not random vandalism. It was a ritualistic cleansing, a desperate, violent erasure of all forms of illumination. The ship's log was missing, but Marcus found a loose sheet of paper tucked into the spine of a navigation almanac. It was a single-line journal entry, written in a cramped, frantic hand, the light. He found the light. We must not guide him. The Luminara belonged to Elias Vance, the retired lighthouse keeper from Point Lyra, who had been dismissed for claiming his beacon had glowed blue and attempting to destroy the clockwork mechanism. Marcus knew the story, a tragic case of a solitary man losing his grip. But looking at the deliberate, meticulous destruction of the light sources, Marcus realized this wasn't a psychotic break. It was a preemptive defense. Vance had smashed the lanterns to prevent the light from being seen, or perhaps to prevent the light from seeing. Marcus immediately radioed the Coast Guard. "Find Elias Vance now, and search every vessel for any blue light source. This is connected." He spent the next few days piecing together the events. Vance hadn't been alone. His grandson, the young engineer Caleb Stone, one of the survivors of the Siren's Call who spoke of the voice singing, had been sailing with him. The logbook was missing, but the vessel's satellite phone records showed one final, garbled outgoing call to a number registered to First Mate Alana Reyes, the other Siren's Call survivor, who now worked as a maritime dispatcher. Marcus tracked down Alana in a small, windowless office near Boston. She was pale, tense, and confirmed everything. "Elias came to me a week ago," Alana whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the overhead fluorescent lights. He told me that the blue light, the one he saw at Point Lyra, wasn't gone. It had simply shifted focus. He said it was hunting those who had seen it, those who knew its malice. And Caleb? Caleb was obsessed with the voice singing, you know that. Elias was trying to save him, to get him to a safe place. He knew the voice and the blue light were connected. Both are lures. Both target a specific kind of spiritual vulnerability. Alana explained the last recorded conversation. Vance had called her in a panic, his voice barely audible over a sound she recognized from her own trauma. A faint, resonant thrumming. He said the Luminara was surrounded by fog, and the blue light had appeared hovering just above the water. It wasn't guiding them to the shoals. It was shining directly on Caleb. Why? Marcus asked. Because Caleb was still listening for the voice. The blue light was acting as a visual amplifier for the auditory temptation. Elias realized the blue light was a beacon designed to attract specific victims, and the voice was the final lure. It wasn't a trap for the ship. It was a final collection for the soul. The journal entry, the light. He found the light. We must not guide him. Clicked into place. He was Caleb, the one still listening for the singing. The light was the blue beacon, which had locked onto Caleb's vulnerability. Vance knew the only way to break the link was to eliminate all human-made light, forcing the blue beacon to lose its target or perhaps its focus. Alana remembered the captain's last, frantic words before the line went dead. I'm fighting the light with the dark, Alana. I'm destroying the map. We're choosing the chaos of night. Don't let them follow! Smash the light! Vance had chosen the desperate chaos of absolute darkness over the controlled, beautiful malice of the blue light. He had smashed every lantern, effectively throwing the Luminara and himself into an intentional, blind surrender to the Black Sea. But why were they gone, and the boat left intact? Marcus returned to the Luminara, this time with a deeper understanding of its history. He went back to the navigation station. The chart table was covered in glass shards, but beneath the smashed searchlight, a folded, thick parchment was taped down. It was the missing ship log. The last entries were written in both Vance's neat hand and Caleb's shaky, looping script. A chilling, dual narration of their final hours. October 28th, 02 Elias Vance. Fog too thick. Dead calm. Smell of ozone and something sweet. Caleb hears the voice again. It's close. Too close. I see the light now. 3 perfect spheres of ice fire. It is shining on Caleb. It's amplifying the song. It is a terrible, precise mechanism. 2:30, Caleb Stone. It's beautiful. The voice is singing me to the light. Not the ship's light, but the blue one. She promises Mother is there, waiting. She says the water is only a veil. Captain Vance is screaming and breaking the lamps. The noise hurts. The light is so warm. 3. Elias Vance. I have smashed every lantern, every bulb. I broke the searchlight. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Absolute darkness now. The blue light is sputtering, losing focus. The sound is fading. We must choose the dark. 3:15. Caleb Stone. He broke the light. He broke the song. But the voice is still here. She is just quiet now. She doesn't need the light. She is telling me to find the water, to step out. She says the water is waiting, and I don't need a door. 3:30. Elias Vance. The boat is still. The blue is gone, but Caleb is standing on the railing. He looks perfectly happy. He says he is following the voice's map, a map drawn on his heart. He says I can't break the light inside him. Cyport 40. Elias Vance. Final entry smudged with salt. I tried to pull him back. I had to choose. He would not stop. I had to let go of the boat. I had to leave the Luminara to show them what I did. I had to make the ultimate warning. We can only fight the light with the dark, and we must not guide them. I follow Caleb now, but I follow the dark. Smashed lanterns are the only truth. Marcus finished reading, the horrific truth settling like a stone in his stomach. Elias Vance had made a final desperate sacrifice. He had smashed every lantern, removing the blue light's focal point. and then had jumped overboard to follow his possessed grandson into the dark, leaving the ship as a final, silent, profound warning. The Luminara was not abandoned. It was deployed. It was a message that could only be read by those who understood that sometimes the greatest danger lies not in the darkness, but Marcus kept the small, thick log sheet, the final testament of the captain who chose blindness to avoid a beautiful lie. And he knew that somewhere out in the deep, vast water, Elias Vance and Caleb Stone had found the ultimate, terrifying rest. Their last action a legacy of shattered glass and absolute darkness. And from that day forward, every time Marcus Keene sailed the open sea, he carried a heavy iron hammer and checked his lanterns, knowing that one day he might have to choose between the safety of light and the necessity of the ultimate, defiant darkness. The tide that pulled back too far. The village of Port Cinder was built on the premise of predictability. For 300 years, its life had been governed by the rhythm of the Atlantic, the reliable 6-hour flow and 6-hour ebb. But on the morning of September 14th, the great heart of the sea skipped a beat and the rhythm broke. Dr. Elara Vane, a marine biologist who had returned to her childhood village to study coastal erosion, woke to an unprecedented silence. It was a dense, heavy silence, lacking the ceaseless swoosh and hiss of the high tide lapping against the stone sea wall. She glanced at her clock. 6 a.m. High tide should have been peaking. Elara rushed to her window. The sight that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs. The ocean was gone, not just retreated to its low mark, but truly gone. The sea floor, a jagged landscape of rock, mud, and ancient wreckage that had not seen the light of day since the last ice age, was exposed. The waterline was a faint, glistening smear a mile or more beyond the farthest reef. The tide that pulled back too far had laid bare the secrets of the abyss. Panic was immediate. Fishermen, whose boats now sat high and dry on the black exposed mudflats, stumbled out of their homes shouting. They were shouting not about the lost catch, but about the terrifying, unfamiliar landscape that now surrounded their village. Elara descended to the beach, the exposed ground crunching beneath her rubber boots. The air, normally cool and saline, was now thick and hot, smelling strongly of sulfur and decay. The sudden exposure of millions of tons of submerged life was already causing a biological catastrophe. Fish flopped helplessly in shallow pools, and the massive, deep-water seaweeds wilted like black flags under the early sun. As she walked toward the distant, shimmering edge of the water, she noticed things that should not exist. First, the color. The exposed earth was not uniform mud. It was patched with vast, iridescent slicks of an impossible purple substance glistening like oil and radiating the heat. Second, the shapes. Embedded in the exposed shale were geometric forms that defied geology. They were massive, perfectly smooth domes and pillars, not carved by water or wind, but constructed of a dark, obsidian-like rock that looked alien against the natural sandstone. These were the ruins of something ancient, swallowed by the ocean before recorded history. And third, the smell. It was the sulfur and the rot, yes, but beneath that was a clean, sharp scent that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The smell of raw electricity and ozone. Reminiscent of a massive generator short-circuiting, Elara realized that the tide hadn't simply ebbed. It had been drained. The Coast Guard, contacted by the bewildered villagers, could offer no explanation. Tides across the globe were unaffected. The change was utterly localized to the Great Bay. The official theory, a massive, sudden tectonic shift, was dismissed when the seismographs showed nothing. Elara, however, wasn't looking at tectonics. She was looking at the exposed deep. She found the focal point, 3 miles out, where the purple sheen and the geometric ruins were densest. The ruins formed a massive circular depression, a kilometer across, at the center of which was a structure that pulsed with the strange, electric smell. It was a perfectly smooth, black monolith of that obsidian rock, rising 20 feet from the center of the depression. It wasn't carved. It was grown. And running from the base of the monolith, across the slick purple floor, were faint, shallow trenches, millions of them, all leading outward, like the spokes of a colossal wheel. Ilara knelt, examining the purple substance. It was biological yet inorganic, a massive, single-celled organism that covered the entire exposed floor of the deep. And the trenches? They weren't erosion. They were channels. It's a biological power grid, she whispered to herself. The organism is harvesting energy from the seafloor, and that monolith is the collector. But what was it collecting? She touched the monolith. It was intensely cold, despite the heat of the sun, and the sensation was jarring, like touching something that was simultaneously rock and liquid. She pulled her hand back, noticing that the trenches running across the floor all seemed to converge on the monolith, suggesting it was not only a receiver, but a generator of the tide phenomenon. As the morning wore on, the strange reality of the exposed ocean floor began to affect the living world. Whales, disoriented and panicking, appeared on the distant horizon, beached in the purple mud, their colossal bodies slowly dying. Birds shrieked, driven mad by the smell and the stillness. Ilara realized that the tide hadn't just pulled back, it was still pulling. The waterline miles away was receding further, the air growing colder near the monolith despite the sun's climb. The monolith was consuming the volume of the Great Bay. It was drawing in the water for some unknown vast purpose. Back in Port Cinder, the villagers gathered on the shore, fear etched into their faces. Old Man Hemlock, the village elder, pointed to the faint, distant waterline. "It is the end, Ilara," he croaked. "The sea has left us. It has pulled back its heart." "No," Ilara countered, clutching her notes. "It hasn't left us. It's being taken. Look at the monolith. It's draining the bay. We need to destroy it before it takes the entire ocean." She found 2 volunteers, Thomas, a gruff fisherman, and Maya, a retired engineer from the mainland. Armed with geological survey tools, they set out across the exposed deep, leaving deep footprints in the drying, sulfurous mud. The journey was harrowing. They navigated around the immense, crumbling wreckage of ships lost centuries ago and avoided pools of viscous, trapped seawater that looked unnaturally black. When they finally reached the monolith, the electric thrumming was deafening. The purple sheen of the organism pulsed rhythmically, a slow, deep heartbeat. Maya placed a sonic frequency scanner against the monolith. Her eyes widened in horror. "It's not just draining the water, Ilara," she shouted over the noise. "It's emitting a low-frequency hum. The monolith is using the water to power itself, and it is using the pressure to send a signal out. A signal beyond the Earth. A signal? To what? I don't know, but the power required is astronomical. This thing is pulling the energy from the entire bay's mass. If it continues, it will create a vacuum. It will pull in the atmosphere, then the land itself." Thomas, the fisherman, saw only the immediate threat. He grabbed a sledgehammer and swung it with all his strength against the smooth, black rock. The hammer recoiled with a terrible clang, leaving not a scratch, but a ripple of blue energy that stunned Thomas, knocking him unconscious onto the purple slick. Ilara knew physical force was useless. The structure was alien, likely designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the deep abyss. She looked again at the massive geometric ruins that surrounded the monolith. The ruins were the answer. They were the key to the machine. She noticed that the circular depression was divided into 12 segments by the geometric pillars. Running along the edges of the depression were grooves, filled with that dried, high-salinity sediment, old, ancient salt crystals left over from a previous, similar event. The trenches. The channels, Ilara realized. The monolith is drawing power from the organism, but the organism is sustained by the water. The water pressure keeps the circuit closed. If we can break the channels, we can disrupt the power flow. She pointed to the vast purple plain. We need to break the connection between the monolith and the organism. We have to sever the power lines. Using their sharpened geological picks and spades, Ilara and Maya began attacking the slick, rubbery surface of the giant organism, cutting trenches deep enough to expose the underlying shale, thus severing the power flow to the monolith. It was brutally hard work. The purple organism was thick and resistant. As they cut, the sound intensified, becoming a high, frantic whine. The cold radiated outward, and the monolith began to pulse with blinding blue light. It was fighting back, trying to repair the damage. They worked for what felt like an eternity, fueled by adrenaline and the terrifying knowledge that the waterline was still receding, revealing ever more distant, impossible secrets of the submerged world. Finally, with a desperate final strike, Maya severed a major channel running from the monolith's base. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The electric hum cut out. The blue light from the monolith vanished. The intensely cold air was replaced by a sudden, rushing warmth. Then the monolith began to vibrate. They didn't look back. They ran across the terrifying, exposed plains of the seabed, their lungs burning, their bodies aching, towards the familiar safety of the shore. They reached the seawall just as the first, distant, faint rush of sound reached their ears. The tide that pulled back too far was coming home. It arrived not with a gentle lap, but with a terrifying vengeance. A massive churning wall of water, not a storm surge, but the entire displaced volume of the Great Bay came roaring back across the exposed, steaming mudflats. Ilara and the others scrambled up the sea wall seconds before the wall of water crashed over the port, swallowing the exposed seabed, the purple organism, the ancient ruins, and the cracked monolith in a single, roaring deluge. When the water finally settled, Port Cinder was battered but standing. The ocean was back, restored to its familiar, beautiful chaos. The tide stabilized, settling at a level slightly higher than normal, as if the sea was reclaiming its boundaries with an added measure of confidence. Ilara never told the full truth. The official report stated a localized atmospheric pressure anomaly caused a temporary extreme low tide, but she knew the truth was submerged once more. She often walked the shore, watching the ordinary, predictable waves. She knew the rhythm could break again. The monolith was covered but not destroyed. The tide that pulled back too far had revealed that the Earth's oceans hold not only life and wreckage, but ancient, terrible technologies waiting for the precise moment of cosmic alignment to drain our world. And Ilara knew her life's duty was now to listen for the silence, the moment the gentle, familiar hum of the sea begins to change. Children who dreamed of a man on the water. The summer of 1974 was the summer the sea turned quiet in the small, insular town of Oakhaven. Not the kind of quiet that follows a storm, but a profound, unnatural stillness that seemed to absorb all sound. And it was the summer the children started to dream. It began with Finn, the 7-year-old son of the harbor master. Finn was a jumpy, cheerful boy, but one humid morning he woke up screaming, clutching his linen sheet. "The man," he sobbed to his mother, Elsa. "The man on the water. He was waiting for me!" Elsa dismissed it as a night terror, a bad reaction to too much lemonade and late-night fishing stories. But the dreams didn't stop. They became vivid, detailed, and utterly consistent. Finn described a tall, thin figure standing motionless on the surface of the midnight sea, miles from shore. The man wore a long, dark coat that didn't move in the non-existent wind. His face was obscured, shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, and he carried nothing but a simple, polished walking stick. "He doesn't swim, Mama," Finn insisted. "He just stands, and he waits." Then, 2 weeks later, 3-year-old Clara, who lived 2 streets over and barely spoke in full sentences, pointed at the television during a weather report featuring the local lighthouse. "Man on the water," Clara mumbled, her eyes wide and fearful, waving. The dreams spread like a quiet contagion. Soon, nearly every child in Oakhaven under the age of 10 was experiencing the same nightly vision. Children who dreamed of a man on the water became the local phenomenon, whispered about by mothers on the docks and dismissed by fathers in the tavern. The descriptions were identical. Always midnight, always miles out, always standing on the unbroken surface, and always the dark coat and the polished stick. Some children added a chilling detail. The man was looking directly at Oakhaven, not moving, but somehow advancing slowly with each passing night. The dreams terrified the children, yet left them strangely obsessed. They would gather by the seawall, ignoring the usual summer games, staring out at the horizon where the man stood in their dreams. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a visiting child psychologist doing research in a nearby university, heard the stories, and grew concerned. She began interviewing the children, looking for a shared trauma or a collective suggestion, but found nothing. The children were healthy, and none had met before their dreams began. They weren't sharing stories. They were sharing a vision. "It's not memory, nor suggestion," Eleanor confided to the town's elderly physician, Dr. Peterson. "It's anticipation. They're not dreaming of something that was. They're dreaming of something that is coming." Dr. Peterson, a man who had seen too many unexplained tragedies on the coast, merely nodded, his eyes cloudy with old fears. "The sea has its own messages, Eleanor, and sometimes it chooses the purest recipients. The adults tried everything to break the cycle. No sugar, early bedtimes, night lights, even sedatives. Nothing worked. The man on the water arrived precisely at midnight, every night, in every child's sleep. The man on the water became more active in the dreams. He started lifting his stick, pointing it at the town. And then he started to sing, not the alluring, siren-like melody of the old folklore, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the children's chests, a sound that promised not rest, but inevitable change. One night, the dreams took a terrifying turn. Finn woke up screaming louder than before. "He's closer, Mama! He's at the reef!" The reef was a massive, submerged ridge 3 miles out, the farthest point of the children's shared vision. The next morning, the children confirmed it. The man was no longer miles away. He was standing directly on the treacherous black reef, close enough that in the dreams, they could almost make out the silhouette of his face under the hat. The fathers, now deeply unnerved, took a boat out to the reef. The sea was still unnaturally calm. They circled the treacherous spot, found nothing but the usual dark shadow of the rocks below the surface, and returned, relieved but troubled. But that night, the dreams showed the man standing even closer, at the buoy. The main navigation buoy, marking the channel entrance, barely a mile from the dock. The fear in Oakhaven crystallized into a raw, palpable terror. The children were losing weight, dark circles under their eyes. They refused to sleep. The adults, sleepless themselves, began to see shadows in the strange stillness of the sea. Eleanor, desperate, gathered all the dreaming children in the community hall. She asked them to draw the man. The resulting pictures, dozens of them, from toddlers' scribbles to Finn's detailed sketches, were identical. The tall, dark figure, the hat, the stick, the silent waiting. Then, she noticed the detail she had missed. In every single drawing, the man was not casting a reflection on the water. He stood upon the surface, but the black mirror of the sea was unbroken beneath him. He was a presence without weight or volume. "What does he want?" Eleanor finally asked Finn, her voice shaking. Finn looked up at her, his eyes impossibly old. "He doesn't want us, Doctor. He wants the light. He wants the lighthouse to stop. The lighthouse, the true heart and constant signature of Oakhaven's safety." Eleanor remembered the strange, persistent hum the children spoke of, the sound of inevitable change. She remembered the stillness, the quiet sea. The man on the water was not just a symbol. He was a precursor to a specific, terrifying event. That night, Eleanor drove to the Oakhaven lighthouse, a tall, white tower manned by a perpetually bored, young Coast Guard operator named Sam. She burst into the lantern room just before midnight. "Sam, you have to turn off the light," she demanded, wild-eyed. Sam, startled, laughed nervously. "Doc, are you serious? The fog's not even in, but I can't just turn off the beacon. It's regulation. It's not fog. It's the man on the water. He's coming for the light. If the light is on when he arrives, something terrible will happen." She told him about the dreams, the shared vision, the consensus of the children. Sam listened with growing disbelief, then irritation. "Look, Doc, I appreciate your concern, but my job is to keep the light running. Now, please, step away from the controls." Eleanor saw the clock hands sweep to 11:59 p.m. She looked out the window. The sea was black and flat. She looked at the light controls, then back at Sam. She knew Sam would call the police, have her institutionalized. But she had to choose the children's terror over adult reason. As the clock struck midnight, Eleanor punched Sam hard in the gut. As he doubled over, gasping, she seized the heavy lever that controlled the high-intensity arc lamp. With a grinding thunk and a loud hiss of dying electricity, the light of the Oak Haven lighthouse went dark. The steady, comforting rotation stopped. Silence. Absolute, terrifying silence. Eleanor rushed to the spyglass. She focused it on the docks, the last point before the open sea. And there he was, the man on the water. He was standing precisely where the lighthouse beam should have hit the water, just 30 yards from the stone breakwater. He was exactly as the children described. Tall, thin, the dark coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the polished walking stick. He was standing on the water as easily as a man stands on stone, without reflection, his shadow somehow falling upward toward the dark sky. He lifted his walking stick, not menacingly but with a slow, deliberate purpose. He pointed the tip of the stick directly at the darkened glass of the lantern room, and then he saw Eleanor. She didn't see his face, but she felt the cold, immense pressure of his presence. It was not anger or malice. Then, slowly, deliberately, the man on the water turned. He lowered his walking stick. He began to walk back out to sea, moving over the flat black surface with the same unhurried, silent gait. He walked past the buoy, past the reef, until he was a faint, dark smudge on the horizon. At 1:30 a.m., when he was utterly gone, the sea snapped back to life. A storm hit Oak Haven with a violence that hadn't been seen in 30 years. Not a local squall, but a massive, sustained hurricane that seemed to rise from nowhere. Waves crashed over the seawall, washing over the town, smashing boats and tearing up the docks. It was the chaos the sea had been holding back. The storm lasted exactly 6 hours, ending precisely at dawn. When the sun rose, Oak Haven was battered, but the children were safe. They woke up exhausted but calm. The man went away. Finn stated simply, eating his breakfast. He was disappointed. Sam, the operator, was confused but unharmed. He fixed the lever and restarted the light. The official story was that a freak storm surge short-circuited the light, and the subsequent hurricane was a bizarre weather anomaly. Eleanor never corrected the report. She looked at the devastation, the smashed docks, the flooded streets, and realized the truth. The man on the water was not the danger. He was the herald. He was coming to mark the town for the inevitable disaster, the storm, and the light was his required target. The lighthouse's beam would have guided the storm's destructive focus, ensuring the town's complete annihilation. The dreams of the children were a shared warning, a collective intuition of an ancient maritime intelligence. They dreamed of a man on the water who was waiting for the light to fulfill its duty so he could complete his own. By turning off the light, Eleanor had removed his target, forcing the man to retreat and the storm to rage blindly, sparing the town's heart. Eleanor left Oak Haven soon after, her research complete. She left knowing that the most reliable forms of guidance are not found in maps and beacons, but in the shared, terrifying visions of the innocent, who alone possess the clarity to see the silent, dark shapes that wait patiently on the water, a lighthouse that lit itself. The Erebos lighthouse stood on a narrow basalt spit known as the Black Finger. It was remote, battered by winds and infamous for its sheer isolation. For nearly 2 centuries, its twin beams had cut through the North Atlantic fog, a reliable pulse of human defiance against the sea's vast indifference. Eliza Holt was the last keeper. Not the last human keeper, but the last one, period. The service had deemed Erebos too remote, too costly, and too volatile to maintain a human presence. They had installed a fully automated, solar-powered LED array, expecting Eliza to pack her meager belongings and retire to the mainland. But Eliza, a woman whose spirit was as weathered and stubborn as the tower itself, refused. She was 35, and she had spent her entire adult life on lighthouses, succeeding her father at Erebos 5 years prior. She trusted the familiar heavy clank of the old clockwork, the scent of hot oil and ozone, far more than she trusted the humming, plastic predictability of the new automated system. She stayed, maintaining the original, colossal 19th century Fresnel lens and the powerful kerosene lamp, treating the automated unit like a rude, silent neighbor. The trouble began in the first week of November. A thick, persistent fog rolled in, trapping the island in a world of muffled white. The solar panels choked, and the automated LED unit, her official replacement, began to stutter, its battery reserves draining faster than expected. Eliza, smugly superior, fired up the old kerosene lamp. The classic warm, golden glow of the traditional light pierced the fog with comforting authority, restoring the familiar 2-second flash, 5-second darkness rhythm of Erebos. But 2 nights later, the wind rose to a gale. The generator, already aging, choked on moisture and died. Total blackout. Eliza, exhausted, climbed the winding stairs to the lantern room. She had no power for the electric lamp, and the backup kerosene tank was low. She managed to fire up the lamp, but the powerful beam struggled to penetrate the driving wet snow and the howling fog. The light was weak, hesitant. Then, disaster. A freak gust of wind, funneled through the narrow vents, slammed the heavy door, shattering the fragile glass chimney of the kerosene lamp. The flame died instantly. The lighthouse was plunged into absolute roaring blackness. Eliza sat on the cold stone floor, utterly defeated. She had failed her post, failed the light, and failed the vessels that relied on her. She had nothing left to power the beacon. She was the last keeper, and the light was dead. She leaned her head back against the massive cold iron casing of the Fresnel lens. The storm outside howled, a savage mocking sound. And then she felt it. A low vibration humming through the iron casing beneath her hand. Not the rattle of the wind, but an internal, powerful thrum that felt like a sleeping giant slowly waking up. The temperature in the lantern room, which should have been freezing due to the broken glass, began to rise, replaced by a strange, dry heat. The air filled with an intense, sharp scent, not of ozone or oil, but of clean seawater and ancient, burning timber. Eliza stared at the center of the giant lens. The lamp housing, empty and dark, began to emit a faint internal glow. It started as a pinprick of green light, deep within the chamber where the bulb and wick should have been. The green intensified, morphing into a brilliant, emerald hue that quickly spread, filling the entire lamp housing. The lighthouse that lit itself had come to life. The light was not driven by wick, wire, or filament. It was a perfect contained sphere of raw, vibrating emerald energy. It was impossibly bright, yet cast no shadows in the lantern room, only a clean, pure illumination. And the beam that shot out from the huge Fresnel lens was unlike anything Eliza had ever seen. It was solid, slicing through the storm and the fog as easily as a knife cuts silk. It was not a warm, friendly gold, nor a modern, cold white, but a deep, mesmerizing sea green. But the most terrifying part was the rhythm. The light was still flashing. Following the 2-second flash, 5-second darkness of Erebos, but it was being powered by an unseen, internal conscious source. Eliza stood, hypnotized as the magnificent, impossible green light rotated, sweeping the desolate sea. It was ancient, alive, and profoundly powerful. The storm died almost instantly around the tower. The winds dropped to a whisper, the snow ceased, and the fog began to visibly retreat, pushed back by the relentless, cold energy of the emerald beam. Eliza spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended awe. The light remained lit, rotating with mechanical perfection without fuel, power, or human intervention. She examined the lamp housing daily. The internal green sphere was stable, suspended in the air by nothing. It was humming with that deep, steady thrum. She began to understand. Erebos was not just a tower. It was a vessel. The granite, the iron, the giant lens, they were not just human construction, but conduits. The isolation, the constant maintenance, the human dedication, all had acted as a battery, storing some kind of latent energy or fulfilling an ancient requirement. And when the human light failed, the true light took over. On the 4th morning, a large research vessel, the Triton II, pulled into the small, battered harbor, its captain looking bewildered. Captain Jonas, a lifelong mariner, climbed the steps, his face etched with confusion. "Eliza, what in God's name is that light?" he demanded. "It's magnificent. It's the strongest beam I've ever seen. But the color green? What new technology is this? Eliza looked at the emerald beam slicing through the clearing sky. It's the backup, she lied smoothly. The new emergency power source. It's unique. Jonas shook his head. Unique is an understatement. I've sailed past here 100 times. That light saved me, Eliza. The fog was impossibly thick, the worst I've seen. But that green beam sliced right through it, showing me the channel clear as day. But the speed, I clocked it. 2 seconds on, 5 seconds off. That old signature. How did you manage to get that rhythm with a new system? I keep the old rhythm, Eliza replied, her hand resting on the cold iron casing. As Jonas spoke, his attention shifted to the broken glass, the dead generator, and the shattered kerosene lamp. He frowned. Wait, this place looks like a wreck. What kind of power source runs a light that strong without a generator? Eliza met his gaze, her own eyes now reflecting the emerald glow. The kind that runs itself, Captain. Jonas, sensing the deep, unspoken truth in the isolation of the tower, backed down. He left quickly, promising to report the new, incredibly efficient green beacon to the mainland. Eliza knew the mainland would send engineers. They would analyze the signal, probe the source, and try to replicate the energy. And she knew that the ancient, sensitive power source, whatever it was, must not be found or controlled or broken. She realized her new duty. She was no longer the keeper of the lamp, but the keeper of the secret. She had to maintain the illusion of human control while serving the ancient self-lit light. That evening, the automatic LED module, which had been dead for days, flickered back to life. Eliza began her final act of devotion. She salvaged the diesel from the main tank, poured it onto the defunct generator, and set it alight. She meticulously smashed the new LED array with the iron bar that had saved her from the storm, then sealed the shattered equipment under heavy tarps. When the engineers arrived by helicopter 2 days later, they found a grim, exhausted Eliza. The automation module failed completely. "Gentlemen," she stated calmly, pointing to the melted wreckage of the generator. A fire, the main lamp. The old kerosene one ran for 3 days straight, incredibly. I barely slept. I think the glass of the lens is damaged, maybe overheated. I managed to fix the clockwork just before you arrived. She showed them the fixed clockwork, the cracked Fresnel lens, and the functional, though now carefully disguised, kerosene lamp. The engineers, seeing the traditional equipment and the exhaustion of the keeper, reported an improbable but possible surge of human dedication that had allowed the old light to keep burning. They replaced the generator and left, convinced they had fixed a simple equipment failure. That night, alone again, Eliza watched the electric lamp flicker to life, throwing its expected, reassuring gold. She listened to the predictable clank of the freshly oiled clockwork. She walked to the massive iron casing. The deep, powerful hum was gone. The emerald sphere was absent. The lighthouse had returned to its human slumber, but as the golden beam swept the sea, Eliza noticed a faint, shimmering sea-green tint clinging to the outer edges of the light. It was subtle, invisible to the naked eye at a distance, but undeniable up close. The lighthouse that lit itself was still there. It was just waiting. It had seen its keeper's sacrifice, and it had retreated, allowing the human ritual to resume. Eliza understood her vigil was eternal. Her job was no longer to light the tower, but to make sure the tower believed she was lighting it. She was the buffer, the shield, the necessary human flaw that prevented the ancient, powerful energy from having to save the world again. She sat down, polishing the lens, her hand resting on the heavy, cold iron. She was ready to wait for the next time the light died, and the true, brilliant green heart of Erebos would once more choose to ignite itself. The final warning scratched into the stone. The Isle of Malachi was a desolate, mist-shrouded hump of granite off the coast of Brittany, uninhabited save for the ruins of a 17th-century fortification and the unrelenting waves. It was a place of ghosts and wind, and it was precisely the place Professor Alistair Finch chose for his final expedition. Finch was not a geologist, nor an archaeologist. He was a comparative folklorist obsessed with unifying the disparate legends of the sea. His current fixation was a recurring motif found in coastal ruins across the Atlantic. A symbol he called the sealed eye, a circle containing 3 downward-pointing dashes. He had spent 2 years tracing the myth of a catastrophic, localized flood that struck these isolated coasts millennia ago, often linking to an entity referred to in obscure texts as the sleeper in the deep. Finch and his single assistant, a young skeptical drone operator named Kyle, had landed on Maliki at the height of a volatile autumn. They set up camp near the central ruin, an ancient watchtower whose lower stones were perpetually slick with sea spray. The focus of their mission was a small, wave-worn altar stone near the tower base, mentioned in a single cryptic monastic text. Finch believed this was the site of the flood's greatest impact, and possibly the location of the most direct evidence. For 3 days, the weather was brutally clear, the low tide revealing more of the hidden, barnacle-encrusted foundations than usual. Kale meticulously scanned the stones with radar and sonar, finding only structural decay. Finch, however, worked with brush and magnifying glass, focused on a specific ancient slab of gray granite at the base of the altar. The stone was utterly smooth, seemingly untouched by the chisels that had shaped the rest of the tower. It resists the chisel. Kyle, but not the mark, Finch murmured one afternoon, his breath misting in the cold air. Kyle lowered his drone, shaking his head. Professor, that stone is entirely smooth. It's metamorphic granite. It's not holding any carving. You're chasing shadows. Shadows have length, Kale. And I believe this stone holds the final measurement. Finch's conviction came from the eerie legends of Maliki, which claimed that the original builders of the watchtower fled in terror, leaving a warning scratched into a stone that only revealed itself when the tide pulled back too far. On the 4th morning, Kyle woke to a deep, unsettling silence. He rushed out of the tent. The familiar roar of the waves was gone. The atmosphere felt strange, heavy, and metallic, smelling intensely of dried salt. The sea, just like in the legends, had retreated. It had pulled back too far. The waterline was a faint, glistening ribbon miles away, exposing a terrifying landscape of jagged black rock and viscous, steaming mud. The low tide mark was not just low. It was non-existent. Finch, already at the altar, was trembling, not from cold, but from profound anticipation. "Look, Kale! Look at the stone!" Kale stared at the slab of gray granite. It was no longer smooth. The intense, unnatural drying of the exposed stone had caused the surface layer to shrink and crack, revealing the hidden depths beneath. And there it was, running vertically down the center of the slab, a series of crude, deep carvings revealed by the sudden, extreme contraction of the stone. The carvings were not made with a chisel. They were scratched, deeply, frantically, as if by bare fingernails or the edge of a jagged piece of flint. The style was desperate, primal, a final act of human terror. It was the final warning scratched into the stone. Finch, barely breathing, began to transcribe the markings. They were a mix of archaic Brythonic script, navigational symbols, and the repeating sealed eye motif. The message, once translated and interpreted by Finch's vast knowledge of sea folklore, told a chilling, coherent story. The sea is only a lock. We built our homes on the lock and were safe, but the key has been turned. The waters drew back, revealing the shape of his repose. Below this place, below the dark geometric ruins, lies the sleeper. He rests in the black heat. He does not wake. He is only disturbed. The sound of our work, the light of our lanterns, the rhythm of our breath, these are the irritants. We disturbed the sleeper in the deep. The tide pulled back too far because the sleeper shifted in his sleep. The flood was not wrath. It was a sneeze. The water returned to cover the shame, but the sleeper remembers the disturbance. His grave light is a lure. It calls to the lonely and the lost. It sings to the despair. Here, the carving explicitly depicted the man of smoke and salt, and the voice singing. The water returns soon. It will be the final flood. It comes not from the sky, but from the depths. It comes to silence the shore. We mark this stone. When the tide leaves, you must not use light. You must not make sound. You must not build certainty. You must not wake what is only sleeping. The only safety is the chaos of man. Destroy the light. Abandon the map. Choose the terror of the moment over the promise of tomorrow. The final warning: do not let him see the sky again. Finch finished reading and looked out at the impossibly vast, empty stretch of exposed seabed. The air still felt charged, the silence heavy. "Kyle," Finch whispered, turning a face filled with horrified certainty. "The legends are true. The tide didn't recede. It was a symptom. And the final flood is coming." Cale, still mesmerized by the revealed stone, pointed to a distant point on the seabed, miles away, where the black, jagged rocks seemed to cluster into an unnatural, colossal mound. "Professor, look there. I scanned that area 3 days ago. It was 300 feet below the surface. Whatever is under there, it is huge, and it is giving off a thermal signature." Finch grabbed his binoculars and focused. The colossal mound was slowly, glacially, beginning to rise from the mud. It was the vast geometric shape seen in other deep-sea lore, a shape of a colossal dome, covered in that purple crystalline growth described by the tide that pulled back too far survivors. "The sleeper," Finch breathed, dropping the binoculars. "He is rising. The warning is not for us. It's for the world. We must not wake him fully." He suddenly remembered the previous maritime mysteries he'd collected. The smashed lanterns on the Luminara, the lighthouse that glowed blue, the children dreaming of the man on the water. They were all linked, not by coincidence, but by a shared, ancient conflict with this vast, sleeping entity. "Cale, your drone, now! We need to cover the island." "Cover it with what, Professor?" "We're on a rock. We must remove the irritants. The warning said no light, no sound, no certainty. We need to make this island disappear. Give me your hammer!" Finch smashed the battery pack of their satellite phone, silencing the possibility of radio waves. He kicked over the roaring gasoline generator, dousing the spark plugs with seawater, eliminating the noise. He grabbed Cale's sledgehammer and, with a grim determination, pulverized the lenses of their high power. Because the warning itself is a mark of human certainty. It's a structure. The sleeper must find only nature, only chaos, only silence. It must believe the shore is empty. Finch smashed the granite slab until the final, frantic etchings were illegible, erasing the very message that had saved them. They retreated to the highest point of the tower, hiding in the darkest recess. They sat in absolute silence and absolute darkness, listening to the horrifying absence of sound. Hours passed. The cold grew bone-deep, and the smell of ozone returned. Finch peered through a narrow slit in the stone. The sun was setting. The colossal mound on the seabed was enormous now, its surface radiating a dim, internal blue light that pulsed with the regularity of a monstrous, distant heart. The sleeper was looking for the irritant, just before the last sliver of sun vanished. Finch heard the sound, a soft, resonant singing. Not loud, but pervasive, filling the air with the sound of infinite rest. The voice singing, a final beautiful lure from the rising sleeper. Finch clamped his hands over Kyle's ears and his own, desperately blocking the melody of surrender. He focused on the granite dust beneath his nails, the cold pain in his joints, the reality of human struggle. Midnight passed. The singing continued, but it remained distant, unresolved. The sleeper, denied the pinpoint light of human technology and the disruptive sound of human communication, could not locate the source of the disturbance. Slowly, agonizingly, the singing began to fade. The massive blue mound on the seabed began to sink slowly, heavily, back into the black mud. The electric smell dissipated. The sleeper had returned to its interrupted rest. At 3 a.m., they heard the first faint sound of the water. The sea, released from its terrible obligation, came rushing back across the newly exposed landscape. It came as a tidal bore, a massive wall of restorative water that crashed over the island, washing away all traces of the bizarre phenomenon. Finch and Cale were soaked, battered, but alive. The tide had returned to its proper height. The island was again just a hump of basalt and ruin. They left Malachi the next day, their boat powered by emergency sail. Finch carried no notes, no cameras, and no proof. The evidence was washed away, destroyed by his own hand, or submerged by the returning sea. His only truth was the memory of the final warning, the desperation scratched into the stone and the cold, terrifying certainty that humanity was not alone, but merely residing on the lid of a vast, sleeping creature whose slightest shift could erase civilization. "What do we do now, Professor?" Cale asked, staring at the gray sea. Finch looked back at the receding shape of Malachi. "We do nothing, Cale. We forget. We live in the chaos of our small lives. We build no more lights. We write no more logs. We trust no more maps. We must allow the sleeper to believe the shore is only silence. The chaos of humanity is the only shield against the deep." He had solved the riddle of the sea. The answer was not guidance, but surrender to the dark. The final warning was not meant to save humanity, but to warn it not to make the same mistake twice. Carolina's silent shoreline, a place. Best avoided, the road to Avery's Inlet was a long, slow surrender to rust and shadow. It was a narrow, paved strip that quickly dissolved into sand-dusted gravel, winding past cypress knees draped in Spanish moss and brackish marshland that smelled perpetually of sulfur and slow decay. Even the sunlight seemed weary here, filtered through a canopy of live oaks whose massive limbs twisted like grasping hands. Dr. Vivian Holloway, a coastal geologist from Duke University, drove the route with a mixture of professional curiosity and mounting unease. She wasn't here for the legends. She was here for the geology, specifically, the inexplicable absence of it. Avery's Inlet, tucked away on the central South Carolina coast, was a geological anomaly. The shoreline should have been a dynamic zone of erosion and accretion, constantly shifting under the pressure of tide and storm. Yet the old survey showed that the inlet and the flanking beach, a 5-mile stretch known locally as the Quiet Mile, had remained virtually unchanged for over a century. It was too stable, too silent. Vivian arrived in the tiny, weathered community of Port Sorrow, the last stop before the inlet. The town was a collection of clapboard houses, docks heavy with barnacles, and a single, faded general store. The silence was immediate and profound. No gulls cried overhead. No children played in the yards. Even the incessant hum of insects seemed muted. At the general store, a woman named May, whose face was a map of sun damage and suspicion, reluctantly directed Vivian. "You're looking for the Quiet Mile, are you?" May asked, her voice a dry rasp. "I am. I'm surveying the sediment." "You won't find much," May interrupted, her eyes fixed on the distant hazy line of the inlet. "That place don't give up its secrets. It ain't meant for outside eyes." May didn't need to elaborate. The sign posted at the end of the paved road said it clearly, hand-painted on warped wood. Carolina's silent shoreline, a place best avoided. No trespassing. Vivian ignored the warning, her scientific skepticism overriding the local dread. She followed the dirt track until the dense oak line broke, revealing the beach. The Quiet Mile was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly unsettling. The sand was a fine, pale gold, packed hard and smooth. The water was a stunning deep azure, reflecting the sky with unnatural clarity. But there was no debris, no driftwood, and no shell fragments, the usual clutter of a working ocean. The beach was sterile. More disturbingly, there was no sound. Vivian stood at the tide line. The waves, though large, broke with a faint, whispering shush, not the expected crash and roar. The wind was a gentle breeze, yet it carried no sound of rustling palmettos or sifting sand. It was as if the very air absorbed the noise. She began her work, setting up core samplers to extract sediment layers. The corer, designed to bore through loose sand, struggled almost immediately. The sand was not loose. It was unnaturally dense, packed with a fibrous, muddy clay unlike anything she had encountered in coastal geology. As she struggled with the machinery, an old man appeared from the dense oak line. He was tall and thin, dressed in faded overalls, his eyes the color of brackish water. He carried a heavy cane made of gnarled driftwood. "You need to leave, Doctor," the man said, his voice surprisingly soft. "I'm Dr. Holloway, and I have a permit to study this coast," Vivian replied, wiping sweat from her brow. "Permits don't hold water here," the man said, walking slowly toward her. His name, she would later learn, was Silas. He was the unofficial, self-appointed guardian of the Quiet Mile. "The shoreline is stable, sir. I'm trying to understand why. The geology—" "It ain't geology, child. It's memory." Silas stopped just short of the tide line, his eyes fixed on the water. "This shore stays silent because it's full of what it took." He told her the history that every child in Port Sorrow learned before they learned the alphabet. The Quiet Mile was not always silent. 200 years ago, it was the busiest, noisiest stretch of coast in the county, a bustling hub for the timber and fishing industries. Then came the year of the Great Silence. A terrible storm hit not just a hurricane, but a profound, unending deluge that lasted for 7 days. When the waters receded, the sea had claimed nearly a third of Port Sorrow's population: families, fishermen, dock workers. "It wasn't the number of dead," Silas explained, his voice low and guttural. "It was the way the sea took them. It took everything at once, in a single roaring bite. And when the sea gave back the land, it gave back a promise." "What promise?" "A promise of eternal stillness. The sea here, it's not resting. It's holding its breath. It refuses to move, to shift, to erode, because if it moves, if it speaks, it will disturb what's underneath." He pointed to the dense, clay-packed sand that resisted Vivian's core. "That sand ain't sand. It's the compacted weight of the missing, held firm by the sea's own guilt. That's why there's no drift, no sound, no shift. The sea is silent here, Doctor, because it is ashamed." Vivian, despite the chills tracing her spine, clung to her science. "That's folklore, Silas. I need empirical data." "Then get your data," Silas challenged, his voice cracking. "But you'll have to go deep, deeper than the sand." Vivian spent the afternoon fighting the earth. Finally, late in the day, she managed to drill a full core sample near the waterline. She extracted the PVC tube, her heart pounding. The core was not sand nor clay. It was a dense, black, fibrous peat, saturated with organic matter. And embedded within the peat, not randomly scattered, but stacked and impossibly preserved, were hundreds of human artifacts. Buttons, buckles, faded shards of cloth, and small, skeletal fragments, all belonging to the missing from the Quiet Mile was silent because it was a mass grave that the Atlantic Ocean itself was guarding. Vivian, shaken to her core, packed up her equipment. She knew her findings would unleash a torrent of ethical and legal chaos, tearing Port Sorrow apart. But her scientific duty demanded disclosure. As she drove back toward Port Sorrow, the sun began to dip below the oaks, and the shoreline fell into a deep, heavy gloom. The atmosphere thickened, and the metallic, sulfurous smell intensified. She stopped the truck just before the pavement began. She looked back at the darkening, silent shoreline, and then she heard the noise. It wasn't a sound of movement or life. It was a profound, mournful groan rising from the exposed peat near where she had drilled. It was the sound of earth shifting, of deep compression being released. Vivian realized her corer had pierced the seal. Her empirical quest had disturbed the profound stillness of the grave. The groaning intensified. The wind, which had been silent all day, suddenly rushed past her, carrying a faint, terrifying whispering. Not words, but the collective sound of hundreds of compressed voices sighing in unison, released by the breach. Panic seized her. She wrenched the truck into gear, flooring the accelerator. She drove past Silas, who stood near the road, his face a mask of silent resignation, his eyes fixed on the inlet. "You woke them!" Silas's silent gaze screamed at her. "Now they move!" Vivian risked one final look in her rearview mirror. The shoreline was moving. Not the tide. The tide was still static, but the land itself. The hard, compacted clay of the Quiet Mile was slowly breaking up, swelling and shifting, and the preserved peat was rising like a black, viscous tongue licking the edge of the water. The sea, having been released from its silent vigil, was finally starting to speak. Vivian reached the safety of Port Sorrow, driving straight to the Coast Guard station. She stumbled inside, gasping for air. "The Quiet Mile! It's moving! The shore is collapsing!" "The sediments." The young officer behind the desk looked at her strangely. "Ma'am, the satellite feed shows the shoreline at Avery's Inlet is completely stable. There are no seismic anomalies, no wind changes, and no reports of erosion." Vivian looked out the station window toward the distant inlet. The air was clear. The town was still. She knew what she had seen. The shoreline was moving, but perhaps only for her. The sea was reclaiming its silence and its secret, punishing the one person who dared to break the stillness. The next morning, Port Sorrow was back to its quiet, eerie normalcy. The shoreline was perfectly stable, the silence absolute. Vivian was asked to leave. Her permit was revoked. She left Port Sorrow, taking with her only the black, peat-filled core sample, the irrefutable evidence of the hundreds of souls packed into the earth. She understood now the final, terrible nature of Carolina's silent shoreline. It wasn't a geological phenomenon, but a supernatural act of preservation. The sea had struck a deal with the land, a promise of eternal silence in exchange for the perpetual rest of the drowned. And Vivian Holloway, the geologist, carried the profound, heavy guilt of having broken the Great Pact. She knew that someday, perhaps in a week, perhaps in a century, the grown